Good morning, everyone. Hello, my name is Dave Zapponi. I'm the CEO of Echo, otherwise known as the Educational Counsel of Homeowners. Thank you for participating in this educational seminar. Echo is a statewide nonprofit association created to support HOA board members and engaged homeowners. Our mission is to foster a better quality of life in community associations through education, advocacy, and connections. For today's event, we have a few housekeeping items. When hovering over the bottom of your screen, you will find several features that are available for use during this webinar. During the general sessions, we ask that all attendees turn off their cameras and mute their mics. Please use the chat feature for any technical issues you may have during the presentation. Also, the chat feature can be used to send a message or a question to the panel or to other attendees. Please always be courteous and respectful of the webinar participants, including speakers, staff, and sponsors. Any participant may be removed at any time at the discretion of Echo. This event is copyrighted by Echo. We do not give permission to others to record the meeting in whole or in part. This program will be recorded. A recording of the general sessions and slides will be emailed to registered participants within 7 days of the program. This is an educational event and not a marketing forum for our non-sponsoring service providers. Event sponsors and speakers have breakout chat rooms to mingle with attendees between general sessions. After each general session, attendees will be randomly placed into one of 6 chat rooms. Each chat room will last 20 minutes. The timer in the upper right-hand corner of the screen shows the time remaining in the session. Once time expires, you will be automatically moved back to the general session. Please enjoy this opportunity to speak with our generous supporters of this event during the chat room sessions. Attendees may move freely from one chat room to another after being randomly placed. There will be approximately 10 attendees per room. To move from one chat room to another, please hover over the bottom part of the screen and click on the Breakout Room button. You will then be able to see the other chat rooms available. Simply click on the Join button to be admitted to the new room. As mentioned above, once time expires, you will be automatically moved back into the general session for the next presentation. We thank the many sponsors of today's program. Please let us show them our appreciation by getting to know them and their products and services during the breakout sessions. It's a good opportunity to ask them tough questions. Our premier sponsors for this event are Homey and the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency. Our registration sponsors are the Helsing Group, Inc., Restoration Management Company. And finally, our breakout chat room sponsors are the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency, Homey, Heritage Bank of Commerce, Restoration Management Company, and Sarman Construction Ltd. Also, we will be raffling off 2 $50 gift cards courtesy of C&A Painting at the end of the planned programming today. Be sure to stay until the end of the program for a chance to win. And now a few words from our premier sponsors, Homey and the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency.
Managing an HOA is no easy feat. That's why we built Homey. Homey is the ultimate financial and operational planning tool for HOA board members. Homey takes your reserve study data and brings it to life, allowing you to keep track of your building expenses and replacements, model different financial scenarios to better project the long-term health of your community, and turn your reserve study into actionable tasks, making it easier to execute for both board members and property managers. Sign up to get free early access to Homey at homey.io.
Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Boland, and thank you so much for taking your valuable time today to listen and learn at an Echo educational event. You know, I joined Echo about 5 years ago, and I really learned a lot. My acceleration was amazing because I listened to so many professionals like we are today going to talk about their specialty, and I learned a lot of best practices. So I'm really glad you're here today, and it's really an honor for me to be a sponsor and to give back to the association that really helped me. And I'm a bit of an old school guy at heart. I love to read books, magazines, and newspapers besides webinars. And one of my favorite journals to read is the Echo Journal. I know a lot of you are aware of this journal, but for those of you that don't, please check this out. There's a lot of really good, useful, and easy to read information and great tips on here. So to help us become better board members. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. I hope you learned a lot today. And of course, as always, if you have any insurance questions, you can always reach me at kevinbolandinsurance.com.
Thank you, Kevin and Samantha, for your videos. These generous sponsors have allowed us to present this program to you free of charge. Thank you very much. Finally, our legal disclaimer. None of what is said during this seminar shall be construed as specific legal or expert advice from the speakers, sponsors, or Echo. If you wished specific advice, we encourage you to contact your attorney or expert as you see fit. Further, Echo is not responsible for the comments of attendees. Attendees are solely responsible for their comments and actions. Echo reserves the right to remove, mute, or edit attendees and their comments at any time as it deems appropriate. So now we'll move on to session 1. We will have 2 speakers in the first session today. Professional engineer and USC professor Henry Kaufman will discuss the science of catastrophic building failure. He will be followed by John Gill of Hughes Gill Cochran Tinetti, an HOA law firm based in Walnut Creek, California. He will discuss the responsibilities of the board when making important decisions for their HOAs. Regrettably, our scheduled speaker, Brad Sohn, Esquire, who is representing some of the plaintiffs in the Surfside case, let us know just recently of an unexpected personal conflict, and he is unable to attend today as publicized. John Gill has graciously agreed to step up and fill the void. Thank you, John. Professor Kaufman is a real estate land developer, licensed building contractor, and registered professional engineer in the state of California. He is also an arbitrator, expert witness, and media consultant. He is currently the Director of Construction Engineering and Management at the University of Southern California. John Gill is the founding principal of Hughes Gill Cochran Tinetti PC in Walnut Creek. Since 1992, John has represented homeowners associations and property owners in construction defect claims, business litigation, and general transactional and corporate matters. He has written several articles and has lectured on numerous occasions for trade associations and memberships on a variety of topics pertinent to the community managers, property owners, common interest developments, and boards of directors. John is also a member of the Echo Board of Directors. Professor Kaufman, you may begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited and speaking to the homeowners this morning. Excuse me. So I'll begin with my title, which seems a little strange. Water is the enemy. We need water to live on, and it's a very essential element for our body. And we get very sensitive when there's a drought, which in Northern California, everyone's concerned about. And so why is water the enemy? Why would I call that? Well, this pertains to buildings or structures or infrastructure that water destroys it. It seems sort of strange because we need water to live on one hand, and the other hand, it helps destroy our society. We'll give you an example. Trees. Obviously, trees really need water when they're living. But once you cut them down and use them as lumber in buildings, you have to keep them away from water. Water destroys them. You have dry rot, destroys the structural integrity of the building. So what I'm trying to talk about today is what dramatic effect water has on our structures. And of course, the best example, which is very relevant and timely now, is the Champlain Towers in Surf City in Florida. And I'll go into some details on what I think happened. I've been called for opinions the day after it happened. Washington Post called me and did quite a lengthy interview and quoted me in their article. And they kept peppering me with questions. What caused it? What caused it? Well, no one really knows now. And if someone comes up with an answer, they don't really know. It's going to take months and probably, I would estimate 6 to 12 months to really find the cause. And I think, just my opinion, it'll be multiple causes, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So let's begin with the next slide. So when the reporter from Washington Post asked me, I came up with, well, there's possible causes. And before I get into that, when I heard of the collapse and I saw a picture of it, the first thing that came to my mind was, man, this was a terrorist act, because I flashed back on the picture of Oklahoma City federal building where there was a bomb and it blew out the front of the building. And when I looked at the Champaign Towers building, it looked like the exact same thing. So my thought went, wow, we got domestic terrorism here. It was a bomb blast. Well, I was wrong. It proved that there was no bomb blast. It wasn't terrorism. It was caused by water. And water was a direct cause, but there was a lot of other things supporting it that failed the building, and I'll go into all those things. So it was sort of interesting that it came out to what the existing conditions of the building was. We all know there was a lot of water damages, and you probably read about it. You're probably very familiar with it. And like I said, whenever you see water, and particularly in your buildings, that's a red flag. Water should not be present. Water is the enemy. It destroys the structure. In this case here, I think that's what led to the collapse. In the Champaign Towers, they had flooding. I think the flooding was from seawater because it was right on the beach and with a high water table, and water leaked in from the sea. And you don't want that. They said something like 2 feet of water and they were bailing it out. I mean, that's should never happen. And you can easily prevent that by doing what they call putting water wells around to pump out the water around the structure. It's expensive, but that's something that you have to keep the water out. And I've seen in construction here in Southern California, several years ago, they were building the Shutters Hotel, which is in Santa Monica at the end of Pico, right on the beach. And they had a 2-story subterranean garage. And when they were building it, they put well points around to pump out the ocean water so they can build the 2-story garage subterranean. And they kept the well pumps there because if they removed the well pumps, water would fill up the garage. So that's something that you have to consider when you're close to the ocean, and obviously it was never considered here. The other things that were that I read was leaks, and it's funny because it's when I was reading this and I realized the configuration of the site, where they had a tower in the front and they had a pool deck in the back, which was supported by a structural concrete slab. And underneath it, they had parking garages. And it was very funny because in 2010, I was called out to do an inspection on a condominium in Westwood on the Wilshire corridor, just south of UCLA. And it was just the exact same configuration where they had a 13-story tower And in the back, they had a supported pool deck over a garage, and that place was leaking. But I'll talk more about that a little later on that case study. So here are some of the possible causes. I think the big one is, number one, is the water damage. I think that was the main culprit. And interesting enough, the more I read about this, and information is coming out piecemeal now because there's a lot of investigation going through, and we're going to learn more and more about it, called forensic engineering now. And it's, like I said, it's going to take time before we get a really final report that we can determine what really caused it. But I think water was the main culprit. There were some design deficiencies. You have to picture that the building was built in 1980. In 1980, well, actually the plans were started in 1979. And if you're old enough, you can remember what was happening in Miami in the 80s. It was wild. I mean, that was a big drug import center, mainly cocaine from Colombia and Mexico. I don't know if you guys remember the television show Miami Vice. It was a wild town, and things were booming. You had the Cuban immigration there. They couldn't build houses fast enough, and it was very attractive because Florida has no state income tax. So it's cheaper, it's a lower cost of living in Florida, and the weather was nicer than, say, New York. So people were attracted to Florida. And so it was a big building boom. And it attracted a lot of builders to come down there and start building. And one of these builders was the guy that actually built Champlain. And he came down from Canada, and he had sort of a shady past. He got in some problems. I don't want to go into that. But anyway, he had some problems, and he hired an architect, and an architect had problems too. And his structural engineer was sort of shady too. And so there wasn't a Class A team that built this. The city was Surfside. It was a small city. It's a suburb of Miami. And as such, they wanted to take advantage of building condominiums because they take advantage of the development fees and the taxes and so forth. So they encourage builders to come down and build. And they just had a part-time inspector. But anyway, when they were building it, it's coming out now. There was a lot of construction defects. Construction defects could be not enough steel, or in some cases too much steel that you couldn't pour concrete around it. It was just a poor inspection. At the time, city of Surfside had a part-time inspector, and things were pretty loose. I guess he was really busy. Things were booming there and trying to keep up with everything. And it seems like he really didn't do a good job. He wasn't on top of things. This is something that we discovered during forensic engineering through the rubbles to see if there was any missing rebar, if the sizes of the columns and the beams were per plans. And what was really strange was that this part-time city inspector was so busy that he delegated the final inspection to the builder's engineer, who was, kind of shady, and he was obviously on the builder's payroll. And it was actually the builder's engineer that signed the final inspection. That should never happen. It's a conflict of interest. But it's sort of a weird things, and when you have these sort of incidents, weird things happen, and this is just one of them. Another thing that I point at is during the life of the building, there was no inspection, at least no formal inspection, and they knew something was wrong. I mean, there was evidence and testimony that there was extreme water leakage, both from the bottom and from the top. And so they knew something was going on, and they just, homeowners and the board ignored the problem. And the other failure, which I think is a major cause, was the waterproofing failure. The supported deck in the back, which supports the swimming pool and the pool deck, you waterproof that. And it just, it failed. And you could tell it failed. So water was leaking from below and up above, and that's a dangerous situation. And nothing was done in 40 years. Everything has a life to it. You know, as humans, we, have a certain life expectancy. Babies today can expect to live to about 100. So everything has a life to it, and even structures have a life to it. And we design buildings depending at least 50 years. Sometimes we'll design it 70, 100 years. I know there's one building here in Los Angeles. It's the LA Cathedral, the Catholic Church, that was designed to last 2,000 years. But every building has a life to it. And this building died prematurely, and there was no need for it. It could have easily be prevented. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now let's talk specifically about the Champlain Towers. It was located in Surfside, Florida. It's right on the coast, on the suburb of Florida, 12 stories high, 136 units. It was built in 1981, only 40 years old. You wouldn't expect a building to fall after 40 years unless a hurricane or an earthquake or a fire took it down. And the configuration was what we talked about in front. The high-rise tower was in the front on the street level. And in the back, they had a supported structural pool and pool deck. And down below, you had, I think it was just 1 story subterranean. I wasn't sure whether it was 1 or 2 stories, but I think it was just 1 story subterranean parking underneath it. So that's the structure of the Champlain Towers as it looks like. Okay, next. So what dawned on me after I read about what the configuration was, and it struck me really weird because I had the opportunity to inspect a very, very similar condominium project in 2010, which is what, 11 years ago. The homeowner, the president of the homeowner, well, actually it was the manager, called me and asked me if I'd be willing to go out and take a look at the condition and get my opinion of what, if it is a problem, or if it is a problem, what we can do about it. It was located in Westwood, California, along the Wilshire corridor where all high-rise are, just south of UCLA, maybe a half a mile. It was built in 1961. It was, so now it's 60 years old, but when I inspected it, it was 50 years, approximately 50 years old. Very similar, and I think we'll find a lot of buildings that are built this way. It was a 13-story tower in the front, and in the back, it's a pool deck and a pool in the rear, underground parking garage. Very, very similar configuration. Okay, I got some chat messages here. Okay, that's a very interesting question, saying that in some occasions they say water is required to keep the structure stable. For instance, the Pisa Tower in Italy, they were doing water injection in the Pisa Tower to try to straighten it out, because we know it was leaning and been leaning for years gradually. And so that was one of the ways they were trying to upright it or keep it from getting to the what we call the angle of repose or failure. Once it reaches a certain angle, then it just falls. So we're trying to keep it from getting to that angle of repose. And you have a very similar situation up in San Francisco with the Millennium Tower, which is leaning again, even during the retrofitting. And that's a huge problem. But we won't get into that in this lecture. Okay, next slide. So when I went out there and looked at it, they took me down to the garage, which was underneath the pool deck. And I was just amazed. I must have seen about 20 rain buckets catching water, and I see water dripping down to the rain buckets. So I asked this, well, how often do you have to clean or, get rid of the water in the buckets? And they say, oh, we do this maybe once or twice a day. It fills up. So very significant leaking, underneath the pool deck there. And then I said, well, does this just happen? Oh, no. This is going on, 10, 15 years, but, we're catching all the water, so there's really no damage to it, And so we have it under control, but some of our homeowners are concerned that maybe it's more than what we think it is, but they were mostly concerned because they lost parking spaces because they couldn't park where the drips are. And the drips, the water was very toxic, very caustic, because not only was the pool deck leaking through the waterproofing, but also the pool itself was leaking. And the pool, has a lot of chemicals in it, a lot of acid to keep it clean, and fluoride, water, and that was leaking through and running through the structural components in the garage, which was all concrete, which is the same as Champlain towers. So they were mostly concerned with the parking spaces, and they said, listen, what can we do to stop the leaks? We tried caulking it, but it didn't really work. We want our parking spaces back. And I walked around, I looked, and not only was the roof, the leaks were coming from above, from the pool and the pool deck, but also there was retaining walls, and it was leaking through the retaining walls too. And that's easy to tell because you have this white effervescence on the walls, and you can see the watermarks coming through. So that whole garage was leaking like crazy, and plus the air was very moist and humid down there. Now, the thing I want to stress to all the homeowners in the audience is that this condition is extremely easy to diagnose, because if you walk in the garage, all the structural concrete elements are exposed. Nothing's covered up. It's a garage. So it's very easy to see if there is any damage. And what do we look for in concrete? We look for cracks and also deflection, sagging. But cracks are mainly the big thing. And the definition of a structural crack, which means if it's a structural crack, you got to fix it because that's failure. That structural element failed. And so it's going to collapse. So the definition of a structural crack, if you do see a crack and take your tape measure out, is 1/4 inch or larger. Anything less than that, we can call it cosmetic or a surface crack. We're not too concerned about it. But cracks have a habit of growing. And when it reaches the 1/4 inch, that's when the bells go off, the red flag goes up. And so when I was in this Westwood condominium, cracks were there was about a 1-inch crack going all the way through a beam, and they usually occur in the mid-span, in the middle of the beam. And you could actually see reinforcing steel, which should be at least 2 inches inside the concrete. And the reinforcing steel I saw was just corroded because it's rusty, or water just eats up steel, as you all know. And so there was very little left of the rebar. So that concrete beam had no reinforcing in it. It was just by itself, and it certainly didn't meet the structural requirements that they wanted. So it was a very dangerous situation. And like I said, it's easy to say. I have a friend, Richard, that just bought into one of the condominiums, not this one, but another one on the Wilshire corridor. And we're having lunch, and he asked me, he says, Hank, what should my condo fall like the Champlain? And I said, no, Richard, it's very easy. You don't have to even call an engineer up. Just go down to the garage with a flashlight and a tape measure, and you can take a look to see, number one, is there any water present? Number two, are there any cracks? And measure the cracks. If it's a 1/4 inch, then call an engineer up. And you have to remediate it immediately. And I guess he did, because he never called me back. And I guess his condo was built maybe 30 years ago. And so apparently his is in good shape. But that's my advice for all you homeowners out there. If you have this type of situation where you have a garage, subterranean garage underneath a pool deck or a pool, go down there and look at it, and look at the structural elements, the beams and the columns and so forth. And if you don't have any confidence, hire an engineer. He'll probably charge you $1,000, but you can see the same thing he can. And if you see something that what I've talked about, that the dangerous situation, then get an engineer and get his opinion. Next slide. Okay, so what I told you is I saw structural beam cracks. It's immediate danger. So we had to do something about it. So the first thing they asked me, they said, well, what's it going to cost to remediate this? What, you know, and I just gave them a ballpark price. And I said, well, there's quite a bit involved. We have to shore up the building, and because the structural elements that we're going to retrofit will no longer work, so we have to put temporary supports in. And then he said, well, do we all have to move out? And I said, no. You can stay in. Everyone can stay in the building, because we can shore up the tower, put temporary shoring in while we're doing the remediation work. And then they said, well, what's it going to cost? And I gave them a ballpark figure, about $10 to $12 million. And oh my God, are you kidding? We can't afford that. We have people here on Social Security. They can't afford. We have to do a special assessment. It's going to cost $150,000 or $200,000, $250,000 for the homeowners, and we can't afford that. And I said, well, I understand. You know, we're talking about a situation here. On one hand, you got your health, life. On the other hand, you got money. What do you choose? And the analogy I make, I think back over a year ago when this stupid virus appeared, and President Trump, and I think he got some bad advice, but he chose not to shut down the economy and to keep the economy going at the expense of our health. And you know, this virus just exploded, and what 600,000 Americans have died already from this COVID-19. I think personally that if we acted fast and shut down the economy, we could have saved a lot of lives. But we're faced with a situation, money versus health. What do you take? What do you choose? I will say one good thing Trump did was he accelerated the vaccines. He said, we need the vaccines, and he authorized it and spent money. We accelerated. We even had an emergency FDA approval, so everyone got vaccinated, and that really helped a lot. But it's a matter of money versus health. And I explained that to him. I said, look, you can't delay. You're in imminent danger. If you don't do something, the building may fall down, and there may be a lot of lives left. You know, up until that time, this never happened. Well, we found out a couple of months ago it could happen. It was a real thing, like the Champlain Towers. So, and I think we'll talk a little bit more. I think the homeowners had a choice of choosing between health and money. That's my opinion. So they said, you know, he says, we're not going to do it. No, it's too much money. So I said, well, look, I hate to throw out my trump card to you, but if you don't do this work, I'm under an obligation as a registered civil engineer to protect the safety of the people, and I have to inform the city of LA. And I am sure the city of LA will come out and they would condemn the building, and you'll all have to move out. So you're going to have to do it one way or the other. And they said, oh, well, I don't know how we're going to explain this, but would you mind telling the homeowners this, the bad news? We don't want to be the bearer of bad news. So can you come to our next homeowners meeting? We'll have an emergency meeting and you can explain this to them much better than we can. So I said, well, okay, sure, I'll go to the homeowners. And they had an emergency homeowners meeting. And they're talking about they have to do an assessment, and everyone would have to pay. And the people that couldn't pay, unfortunately, they'd have to sell, and they'd have to sell at a loss because the assessment will go against the sale, and the new buyer wouldn't want to assume that responsibility. So in fact, their unit depreciated by whatever, $150,000. So it was a real financial hardship. And I think 2 or 3 of the residents had to sell. It's unfortunate, but heck, it's better than them dying. Well, they had a vote, and I guess I was pretty convincing because they gave the approval. And I'm glad to say now the building is still standing. I really believe if they kept ignoring the problem, we would have the same situation as Champlain Towers. Next slide. Oh, okay. Well, I still have some time. Go back to that. I talked a little fast, I guess. Let's see. What else I can add to that?
You want to take a couple questions, Professor Hoffman?
Sure.
Okay. Well, one of the questions here is about absentee owners. We have quite a few absentee owners in the Surfside condominium situation, and she's wondering if because there are families that don't actually reside there, and I presume there are a lot of families that do reside there, but I don't know that. She wants to know if maybe this more transient population could have added to the magnitude of the deferred maintenance.
No, I think these were really natural causes. I think the water intrusion from down below, from the sea level, and then also the failure of the waterproofing on the pool and the pool deck contributed to it. These were, you might say, natural causes, and maybe poor maintenance. You point your finger to your building engineer, that he should be yelling and screaming and stamping his feet saying, we need to do something. Nobody likes to spend money. I'm sure the audience can appreciate that. And so you call deferred maintenance. And you just go so long and so long before something really drastic like this happened. They weren't aware, well, they were aware a little bit from what I read, they were aware that there was something dangerous going on. They called an engineer a couple of years ago, and the engineer wrote a report saying, we have a bad situation here, a dangerous situation, we have to do something. And so the homeowner association, him and hawed and pondered and stalled around. And finally they came up about a year or half a year ago, they came up with a solution. They said, oh, okay, so we had this engineer come out and he said, there may be a problem. But let's call the city up. I mean, they're in charge of building and safety, so they should come out. Let's get their opinion. So the city inspector came out, and I don't know what he was probably looking at the wrong building or something. And he said, oh, nothing's wrong. You're okay. And so, oh, great. They ran with that. Oh, we're so relieved. We don't have to spend any money. And we got the city saying we're safe. Well, the inspector obviously didn't know what he was talking about. And so I'm sure there'll be a lot of liability, which I don't want to talk about because I'm not a lawyer. But it was just a parade of mistakes being made on Champlain Towers that led to it, and it could have been avoided. We don't know all the facts. I don't think we ever will. What the board did or did not do, or what they could have done. But to answer the question, what impact, if any, do absentee owners have on this situation, which I'm sure most condominiums, if not all, have absentee owners or renters or whatever? Really none. I think it's incumbent upon the Homeowners Association, especially the board of directors, to recognize this problem. And if they don't recognize the problem, if they've been informed of the problem, to act on it. That's really where the real action should come from. And then again, it's going to cost money, and the homeowners are, it's a hardship. Who wants that? So I don't know, maybe the lawyers can talk about recovering the cost of the retrofit for the engineer of record or the architect of record, or go after the builder, developer, contractor, whatever. But they can tell more, speak more of that, because there is a statute of limitations. In California, we have 1 year parts and labor, and after that, the contractor, everyone's off the hook, except that there is such a thing called latent defects, hidden defects, and that is 10 years statute of limitations. And those are things you couldn't see.
Yeah, and I think John's can touch on that as a construction defect attorney. We can get into that world.
Henry, this is John Gill. If I could ask a couple of questions. One observation I have in listening to your presentation and having litigated construction defect claims for 30 years, there is often a disbelief in people that we explain that there's something wrong, and it could be pretty significant. Nobody wants to assume that the worst could happen. And of course, the Champlain Towers disproved that. It was breathtaking seeing what happened there. The collapse of balconies in the balcony in Berkeley that I'm going to talk about in a little bit disproves that. But as an engineer, you go to a homeowners meeting, and one of the challenges board members have, may be wrapping their own brains around, this could be awful. We need to protect against the worst case scenario, but then transmitting that and persuading members that they need to spend money because it really could be that bad. Now, I know since the Champlain Towers tragedy, the types of questions I'm getting from board members and homeowners are completely different. It's, are we okay? Are we protected? But maybe as an engineer and a construction expert, you could address just the general idea of how significant these problems are, and I don't want to say how widespread, but what do we do to persuade people that this isn't just finding something wrong for the sake of finding something wrong?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. I think this is a wake-up call for everybody, and there's going to be legislation, which I'm sure you're going to speak about. And you mentioned the Berkeley balcony collapse, which I was an expert witness on, and that was visible. You could see it.
Yeah.
And it's up to the homeowners to protect their investment, you might say. And so if they see something, and even if they don't know what they're seeing, they should report it. And that some professional come out and make a judgment on it. And you'll see more and more of this. But I think the message is to the homeowners, hey, this is a big investment of yours. There's no, deferred maintenance, and you can understand you don't want to spend money, but this is something you may lose your life on. And look at the Champlain Towers. I mean, what more example? Look at the Berkeley balcony collapse. I mean, do you want to risk your life? That's the question. You hit them with that, or you have to spend the money. And this is a safety issue now. And you'll see some legislation, and in engineering world, anytime we have a big disaster, earthquakes or fire, we always go back and examine forensic engineering, and we change the code. We strengthen the codes. We learn from it. This should be a learning experience. We don't want this to happen to your building. And you have the eyes and ears when you go to your car. If you see water dripping on your car, oh my gosh, report it. If you see any kind of leakage, report it. Water is the enemy. You should not have any exposed water.
So Henry, who are you reporting to?
I would report to the Homeowner Association. I would do it in writing, saying, I think we have a condition here that needs investigation. Please look into it. This is a safety issue. Even though you say, well, what water's a little dripping, big deal, dripping water, you know, my faucet leaks, big deal. The building's not going to fall down. Well, we should know from the Champlain incident that it could be a huge disaster. We don't want that to happen.
If I can ask one other question as a follow-up, we've been using the term deferred maintenance, and sometimes we use deferred maintenance as an umbrella term. But for the sake of discussing this with homeowners and board members, to me there are two different categories. One is we see something that may be wrong. There's a duty to investigate and work with experts, and I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes as soon as we finish up your questions. The second is the idea of ongoing periodic maintenance on a regularly scheduled basis. And there can be a temptation if there's some sort of a waterproofing maintenance issue that is budgeted to address every 5 years. There can be a great temptation as lay people to look at things and say, you know, it doesn't look like there's any need to do anything. Let's get a couple more years out of this and not spend the money, which literally would be deferred scheduled maintenance. Are there, which is almost a different challenge that homeowners associations face with regard to issues like Champlain Towers or the Westwood building. Are there interim maintenance steps over the years that could be taken that would prevent things from getting to the point where we realize, wow, there's a really big problem? Or is it more of a fact that we just need to be vigilant in keeping an eye out for bigger problems? How do you balance the two?
Well, yeah, I'm very concerned about water. So if you see water, try to trace where the water is. And that's always a mystery, find out where the cracks is. And you can caulk it while it's young and before it's spread and it gets bigger and bigger. So if you do see water, try to stop the leak, and because it's just going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And it's just observation, watching it and monitoring it. If it's a small crack, you can watch it, and when it gets big. One of the questions in the just in the chat said that they had a 1/4 inch crack on a slab over dirt. That's a structural crack. That slab has failed. So you need to remediate that. And I would really recommend you get a structural engineer out to examine it and to make up a fix solution to it. Anytime you see a structural crack, 1/4 inch or bigger in concrete, fix it. Also in retaining walls and block walls. Now in block walls, it's very easy because it's what we call sawtooth. The structural crack will look like this, stepping down, like stairs. And that's an indication that concrete block wall has failed. And if you're in doubt, spend $500 or $1,000, get a professional opinion and get it in writing and a report so you can have it in your record that, hey, we did investigate this and we have a professional opinion here and he says everything's fine. And also you can call the city up and they'll be glad to come out and do inspections. I don't want to steal your thunder, John, but I really think that one of the things that come out of the Champaign is there's going to be some regular inspections taking place. I look for that. You know, it, it's very serious, very, very serious. And hopefully this is a wake-up call for this homeowners association, especially if your building has the same configuration. If you have a supported concrete slab over a garage that supports a swimming pool and a pool deck, you know, watch it real carefully. And it's easy to do, just walk down there. It take you maybe 10 minutes, easy to check on that. Also, one of the things that they talked about was they put trees and they loaded up the deck more than was structurally designed for. So that's another thing to see if you got some big equipment sitting on the deck or whatever, big trees or planters, this sort of stuff that adds weight to it, which exceeds the design loads.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's wonderful information. We're going to have John Gill speak now, and then we'll take some questions. We're going to have 15 minutes of questions. And remember, we do have the chat rooms following this, so you can ask questions during the chat room in the speakers room. So let's go ahead, John, and start your program, and we'll do that right now. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Dave. So as Dave mentioned at the beginning of this program, Brad Stone, a Florida plaintiff's attorney, was scheduled to be here to discuss the potential liability issues for various parties related to Champlain Towers. I'm a California attorney and really can't address the specifics of that situation, but instead I'm going to take the next 8 to 10 minutes or so and discuss issues related to California boards of directors as it relates to fiduciary duty, informed decision-making, relying on experts. And we're going to look at that in the face of the results of a tragedy like Champlain Towers or the Berkeley balcony collapse that we're going to talk about after the break, or any situation where a homeowners association has some sort of a tragic event. And I really like the term wake-up call that Professor Kaufman used. That results in significant injury or loss of life or significant property damage. So if you go to the next slide, Connor. So Surfside really was a wake-up call given the tragedy of unimaginable proportions and the devastating loss of life. Anytime there is a significant tragedy like this, it's human nature, among other things, for everyone to start asking questions about who is in charge here? How did this happen? Who do we blame? How could this have been avoided? And so what I want to talk about, the first questions inevitably go to the Homeowners Association and the Board of Directors. And all actions of the Board of Directors in California or failure to act are evaluated to determine whether board members have fulfilled their fiduciary duty to the Homeowners Association and all members. So the types of questions we get asked: was there an issue, for example, with Champlain Towers with the pool's maintenance, the pool deck, known leakage? Were experts consulted? Did we bring in an expert to validate the issue and give us advice? And in that regard, did the experts that were consulted advise the Board of Directors of potential dangers? If that was the case, the Board of Directors has an absolute obligation to act to prevent against the worst case scenarios, even when we struggle to believe that they might actually happen. When you get expert advice, you have to rely on it. Were there alternative solutions looked at? Was there ongoing preventative maintenance that could have reduced these risks? And finally, were members of the community informed of the risks? Or was the idea that something was wrong a complete surprise? So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to discuss for the next few minutes the concept of fiduciary duty of board members and the general concepts here that we're going to talk about. I'm going to explain what fiduciary duty is, so board members understand the standard that they're supposed to follow. We're going to talk about the proper board decision-making processes. Fiduciary duty is all about the decision-making process utilized by board members to make informed decisions to benefit the community with the right motivations. We're going to talk about the business judgment rule that is part of the corporations code that explains the correct decision-making process. And finally, we're going to talk about protecting board members from personal liability by making decisions in the right way for the right reasons, where such decisions are informed and largely based on expert advice. So next slide, what is fiduciary duty? A fiduciary is a person to whom property or power is entrusted for the benefit of another. It is the highest duty of care and loyalty that is recognized by law. And every board member owes a dual fiduciary duty, not only to the Homeowners Association, the corporation, but to all of the association members. Now, board members are entrusted with the duty to preserve, protect, and enhance property values and protect the building occupants from harm that is foreseeable. And in a homeowner, let's say you have a 50-unit condominium development in the Bay Area, and we're going to say, let's say you have $500,000 condominium units, and you have 50 of those condominium units. Board members are entrusted with the care and protection and preservation of $25 million of other people's real estate and all the money that is paid to maintain and manage that real estate for the benefit of all the members and the protection of all the residents. And fiduciary duty means that the board members need to go about that process in the right ways to protect the members, protect the corporation, and protect the directors themselves. So if we can go to the next slide. To comply with fiduciary duty, what fiduciary duty law says, board members must act in good faith with a genuine intent to do the right thing in the best interests of the association as a whole. All of the members may not be in agreement with what you're doing, but you're always looking to the best interests of the entire association. Directors can't put their own interests ahead of the association or individual members or the people that directors may get along with the best. They have to look at the interests of the whole. Acting only after reasonable inquiry. This is the key to fiduciary duty. Reasonable inquiry means you do enough of an investigation to make fully informed decisions. And in the context of construction issues or safety issues, it requires that you rely on the advice of experts in the given field when you're dealing with things that are beyond normal lay experience. We often run into a wall with directors and homeowners generally when it comes to hiring consultants, hiring experts, having to pay money that maybe isn't budgeted. And I've heard many directors over the years say, well, we can't do that. It's not in the budget. It wouldn't be prudent to spend money that isn't in the budget. And we need to save the members money. Fiduciary duty doesn't mean that you decline, that you don't spend money. It means that you spend money prudently. And when you're dealing with things that affect the health and safety of the occupants that are beyond normal lay understanding, hiring experts and relying on them is the most prudent thing imaginable that you can do. And finally, the last stage of it is board members must act in a way that an ordinary prudent person would act under similar circumstances, and understand that is being judged after the fact, not in real time. So if we go to the next slide, general principles of board decision-making. In order to govern the association, the directors need to make informed decisions, and the board members should act in a manner that is consistent and reasonable toward all members as a group, act within the scope of the board's authority as identified in your CC&Rs and under the Davis-Sterling Act, the Civil Code. And the association does have a responsibility that is delegated to the board of directors to preserve, protect, and enhance property values. And in a condominium development, the board is responsible for the overall maintenance and repair of the majority of the structures, and finally comply with the business judgment rule. So if we go to the next slide, the significance of this is the business judgment rule protects board members from personal liability. And so what it says in Corporations Code section 7231, if directors and the board act in good faith in the manner that they believe to be in the best interest of the association, using reasonable inquiry, relying on experts, and acting as an ordinary prudent person would under similar circumstances, the business judgment rule protects those decisions and protects the directors from individual liability. The association may be responsible for the results of a decision that cause harm, But the individual directors are protected from personal liability if you follow the business judgment rule. What the law says is that if you make decisions the right way to protect the association, you individually as directors are protected from personal liability. So our final slide, I know we're up against a time wall. Some concluding thoughts. You didn't volunteer to serve on the board of directors to take on personal liability simply to save your neighbors a few bucks. And we often see a reluctance to spend money, whether it's hiring experts, ongoing maintenance, or even proceeding with significant repairs when there's a warning that things are wrong and could cause significant harm. Your job isn't to save money for your neighbors because they want their assessments low. Your job is to spend money prudently to protect the physical plant and protect all of the occupants. And in the course of that, you want to make sure the association carries minimum levels of insurance. You want to make sure your directors and officers' liability insurance is in place and fully paid up. And you want to make sure you're acting within the scope of board's authority, but always informed decision-making, relying on experts is your best avenue to guarding against these sorts of disasters. And just as important as getting expert advice is following it, not challenging it, not negotiating it, but when you get independent expert advice, if you don't like the advice, get a second opinion. But if you get advice and refuse to follow it, it's just as bad as not seeking it out at all. Dave, I think I'm a minute over. Dave, you're muted.
Unmute. Okay, John, you went fine. That's great. We're going to run until about 10:15, taking Q&As. I'll moderate some of those. You can pick some of them out. I have a question, John, of those people. Professor Kaufman suggests, and Professor Kaufman, you can unmute as well at this point. Professor Kaufman says if you see that a quarter-inch or larger crack, report it to the board of directors. So say a person reports a quarter-inch crack to the board of directors. What does the board of directors, what's their duty to do when they receive a report of that nature?
Well, I would, again, I'm no attorney, but I would think that they would need to investigate it. It could be valid, it could be invalid, could be nothing, but they should make an assessment. And if they feel uncomfortable, they should bring in an expert, especially when you're dealing with structures. You need to bring in a structural engineer, professional engineer to write a report. And it doesn't cost that much. And also, I think they need to inform the homeowners. Even if you have an absentee homeowner, you have to email or do something to inform that there is a potential danger here.
So, John, you wanna add on to that, or?
Yeah. So, with regard to fiduciary duty, when there is a condition that appears to be abnormal, that is enough to stand out as, wow, that looks curious to us. I wonder if that represents a problem. As lay directors, doing nothing may amount to nothing, but if something goes wrong, doing nothing represents a failure of the directors to make informed decisions. So I would encourage, if there's something significant that stands out that looks unusual and is beyond normal lay experience, you want to get an architect, an engineer, a contractor, somebody with a basic understanding of what typical performance is to do an initial evaluation and advise the board whether there is anything of concern that may require further evaluation or some maintenance or repair. At that point, if the answer is no, doing nothing may be the right informed decision. The problem is if you don't get the independent advice on something that lay people don't otherwise really understand, you're running the risk of being wrong doing nothing. And that's what would blow back to individual directors if something goes wrong.
Okay, so from a homeowner's perspective, they report to the board of directors and the board doesn't do anything. Is there another step that the homeowner could take with respect to their concern?
Well, in a homeowners association, the typical form of governance is that decisions of the association are largely made by the board of directors. So the homeowners typically, the non-director homeowners typical recourse would be to write letters, attend meetings. There's a member forum at each meeting, and ask the questions and express the concerns. Does the individual homeowner have the ability to do their own independent investigation? Well, it depends, and probably goes beyond the type of targeted advice that you'd want to get from your own individual attorney. But generally speaking, if you're dissatisfied with the response of the board of directors to an expressed concern, the recourse is to show up at meetings and ask the question and see what the answer is, and encourage an investigation.
Yeah, and get it in the minutes so it's on record.
Yeah.
And if it is a structural, you can always call the city up or the county, whoever has the jurisdiction, to send out an inspector. And the key word is safety. When you call them up, you're concerned about a condition that would affect the safety of the building and the tenants. They have to act on that.
But the initial step is to talk to the board of directors.
Yeah, go through the chain of commands.
Make sure that they're
react. But if they say nothing, then you do have recourse.
So John, I have another question for you. What happens if you're in a multi building complex or HOA with, say, 3 or 4, 6-story buildings, condominium complexes that's in one HOA?
Yeah.
And we find that the structural defect or the problem that we have is only in one of the buildings, and the other 2 buildings just say, hey, they should have taken care of their building better. We're not going to vote to allow that a special assessment to pass because that's their problem and not ours. What do you do about that, and who's responsible?
Well, again, I'm going to keep my advice generic because there are these variables that are specific to each association. Generally speaking, when you have multi-building, multi-family developments, the homeowners association is the governing body that is responsible for all of them. And in most circumstances, all of the members have a responsibility to contribute to the upkeep of the entire development. Now, there may be some communities where the CC&Rs have a different structure in terms of who pays for what. I know sometimes with variable assessments, it's building by building in terms of what's contributed to reserves for maintenance and repair, or what's contributed to the budget. But generally speaking, in most condominium associations, for example, the association is responsible for maintenance and repair of the structures of all of the buildings, and all members are responsible to contribute some share to the association carrying out its obligations. Again, there may be variables. You should consult with your own individual counsel for more targeted advice. But when it comes to that, not only does everybody typically have a responsibility to contribute, but if you have 4 multifamily buildings and one of them has significant damage issues, that can drag down the property values of the entire community. You can have a stigma issue with your own building that appears to be in perfect shape. So that's another consideration. But generally speaking, the cost of these things is share and share alike by all members into the association meeting its obligations. There is one other thing that I just want to mention. There are circumstances, if you have a building that represents an imminent threat of harm to the occupants, there may be circumstances where a special assessment could be considered an emergency assessment that doesn't require a member vote. You really need to consult with the association's counsel before taking that step. There are legal ramifications, but if there's an imminent risk of collapse, a member vote may not be required because it may be literally a legal emergency where the board can levy the assessment without a vote.
Yeah, and I'd like to just segue over to another potentially catastrophic event. We just had an earthquake last night. In fact, here in Carson, in Southern California, we have earthquakes throughout the state of California. Can you address how what we should be looking for with respect to retrofitting the buildings, Professor Kaufman, on this, and what are the members, what needs to be done in California with respect to earthquakes and protecting your building, and what should you be looking for after an earthquake when you do your physical inspection? Okay,
I've been asked this question many times, and I want to give assurance that our buildings are safe. We design them to withstand the earthquake, that they don't fall. They may fail, but they won't fall down and kill people. So we're all good on that. There is retrofitting. Someone mentioned soft-story buildings. We're in the process of retrofitting all the soft-story buildings now, because we found in the '94 earthquake that we didn't design them properly, you might say. So we are looking, after every earthquake, we are doing forensic engineering, see how we can improve that, so that if something happens again, we're better protected. What to look for? Cracks. That's your main thing. Stucco cracks, concrete cracks, separations. Usually earthquakes you'll see is very unique, especially on the outside of the building. If it's stucco, you look for X cracks like this, because the building will sway one way, crack, go the other way, crack. So if it shows X, that you know that there was earthquake damage on that. That's what you look for.
Okay, that's good.
Dave, there were a couple questions in the chat about directors doing independent investigation and research without relying on outside experts was one form of the question. And another had to do with an architect on the board that second guessed the advice from independent experts, wanted to argue it, and was potentially advising the board to disregard the expert and rely on the architect director. So here's the issue with all of that. Anytime board members rely on outside independent advice that they believe to be credible, they believe the person credibly to be an expert in a given field, the board members are protected by relying on that outside advice from a knowledgeable expert. It is possible for the board members to be protected relying on another director who genuinely has an expertise. The problem in that situation is that the director, the architect director acting as an expert, that director isn't going to be protected from personal liability. That director is now acting as the expert, not as a volunteer director. So while the rest of the board may have individual liability protection, it's not fair to the architect director that is acting as an expert. So I get the point that maybe the architect on the board is the smartest person in the room and wants to be recognized as such, and we don't need anybody outside, and we don't need to spend money on that. You've got me. The problem is that director inadvertently is taking on individual liability or professional liability if it turns out they're wrong or something goes on. For the sake of that director, the entire board needs to encourage independent expert advice. And as for directors doing their own research and not getting independent expert advice, yes, that does potentially harm the association and also exposes that director to individual liability if they don't seek out and obtain independent expert advice.
Okay. So there's one last question we'll squeeze in here, John, and it's what if one director actually sees or believes they see a problem and presents it to the board, the other board members? What recourse does that one director have if the others don't agree with him?
Well, they have the recourse to be loud. They have the recourse to I think any individual director can seek out information regarding who credible experts might be and bring that to the entire board's attention. An individual director doesn't necessarily have the authority to act unilaterally to bind the association. I think the individual director has the ability to write to the other board members, ask that things be considered at board meetings. make motions that maybe aren't seconded and explain the basis of the motion, which would translate to the minutes, and generally continue to express the concern to be very clear that that director perceives a problem. And, you know, that director has the ability to speak to the other directors individually between board meetings to explain their perspective and try and persuade one or two others to come on board. You need to be careful that it's not a quorum of the board meeting between meetings so that you don't violate the Open Meeting Act. But that director needs to continue to present the potential issue to make clear that the director perceives a problem and thinks it should be investigated. And if the board declines, the director should then recommend that the board get a legal opinion from the association's legal counsel that everybody can rely on in terms of whether expert advice is warranted.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're gonna stop this Q&A session. We're gonna move into our chat rooms. We will now move into our breakout chat rooms. As a reminder, all participants will be randomly placed in the breakout chat rooms to start off the session. Once placed in the chat room, you will be able to move between the chat rooms by hovering over the Zoom options bar found at the bottom of the screen and selecting the breakout room icon. Once selected, you may then click on the chat room you wish to join. You may switch between chat rooms as often as you like. The speakers of each session will have a breakout chat room to answer additional questions you may have. So John and Professor Kaufman will be available in a speakers chat room. The breakout sessions are sponsored. Please take this time to learn about their great products and services and how they may be able to help you in your communities. Connor, please take us into the chat rooms. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you for taking the time to talk to our various sponsors today and to the speakers. Listened to some very good questions and got some very good responses. So thank you for that. Our second session of the day is entitled Implications of the Surfside Tower Collapse, presented by David Mangini, Esquire, John Gill, Esquire, Lisa Triplett, CCAM, and AMS. David Mangini is the Director of Business Development and General Counsel at Sarman Construction, Ltd. Prior to joining Sarman Construction in 2020, David spent 20 years litigating and resolving construction, insurance, and other business disputes. David is an avid participant in the Homeowner Association community, having represented associations exclusively from 2010 to 2020. For the 10 years prior, he represented developers, general contractors, architects, engineers, and specialty manufacturers. Lisa Dial Triplett holds a bachelor's degree from the California State University, East Bay in communications and with an emphasis in organizational dynamics and a minor in industrial psychology. She started as a community manager, and has been in the industry for more than 20 years. She has worked for a large international management companies as well as boutique-style management companies during her career, giving her a unique view on the needs and management companies and homeowner associations that they're facing today. Her expertise in staff and client retention is achieved by creating healthy, functioning teams. Lisa works with boards, vendors, and staff to create collaborative and productive working relationships. John Gill will also be joining this panel of presenters. As mentioned earlier, John is a founding principal at Hughes Gill Cochran Tinetti and an experienced HOA attorney and esteemed member of the ECHO Board of Directors. David, you may begin.
Thank you, David, for the introductions. Hello, ECHO friends. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to segue from the Surfside condo collapse into a more California-specific legal and property and board discussion. As we heard before, the Surfside collapse there are a lot of moving parts to it in determining what went wrong. It's not expected that there will be a formal report on that for another few years. It's being investigated at the federal, state, county, and municipal level. The NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has run up 4 other major collapse and fire incidents since they were commissioned to do those investigations in 2002. They were the agency who reported on the World Trade Center. They're similar to the the NTSC, the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigates automobile incidents on highways. So it's an analogous situation. They call in the super specialists when it comes to these major issues. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, Health Administration, is also involved, as are the county and the town in which the Surfside condos are located. There will be laws enacted in Florida. There is no question about it. There is a lot of discussion already going on a state and county and municipal level there. And there will be a national ripple effect in response. I'm going to be speaking for a stretch during this presentation about an analogous situation with a massive casualty and injury incident in 2015, the Berkeley balcony collapse, and what the California legislature did to enact a law that, or 2 laws, one that's for associations, the other for apartment buildings, and the ramifications of that law on associations and how associations should engage in best practices in making sure they're in compliance with this new law. Next slide, please. John, I'm going to have to turn this over to John, who was heavily involved in the legislative process arising from the Berkeley balcony collapse.
Thanks, Dave. So very briefly, how we got to SB 326 that Dave will take us through in a minute. What you're looking at here is a photograph of what remains of a 5th floor balcony that collapsed in 2015. There were 13 college-age exchange students on the balcony that collapsed. They fell 40 feet. It was a horrible tragedy. There were 6 fatalities. 7 others on the balcony were seriously injured. It was a tragedy by any metric. There was a significant investigation into the causes of the collapse. This is a 9-year-old apartment complex, the Library Gardens apartments in Berkeley, and the investigation revealed that if things had been built properly and maintained, this shouldn't have happened. It wasn't a situation where there were too many people on the balcony to handle the load that it should have been able otherwise to handle. This is a result of construction defects and apartment owners closing their eyes to a dangerous situation. So 28 days later, the city of Berkeley passed an emergency ordinance requiring the inspection of all balconies and elevated appurtenances in the city of Berkeley every 5 years and certification of that. The state then jumped in with SB 721 that requires inspections and destructive testing every 6 years. Condominiums were part of that bill for the first, it was a 2-year bill. In the first year and a half, it was envisioned to apply to apartments, maybe hotels and condominiums. But about a year and a half in, condominiums were extricated from that. So it's now known as the Apartment Balcony Inspection Bill that's codified in the Health and Safety Code. That took effect January 1, 2019. And the following year, SB 326 was introduced and passed. It applies to condominium buildings with 3 or more dwelling units And Dave is going to talk about what exterior elevated elements are and what the inspection requirements are. That took effect January 1, 2020, and applies to all condominium buildings with 3 or more separate dwelling units for all exterior elevated elements. So we have different bills. There may be references to comparisons between the apartment bill and the balcony and the condominium bill, simply because there was so much information about SB 721 that now doesn't apply to condominiums, but to the extent that there's any confusion, we may talk about distinctions. So Dave is going to take us through the details of the required inspections, and then Lisa Triplett and I are going to talk about the roles and what needs to be done by boards of directors, managers, consultants, legal counsel, and some other issues to help associations to comply with the inspection requirements. So I'll turn it over to Dave to tell us about SB 326.
Thank you, John. Okay, so the discussion is all about exterior elevated elements, otherwise known as EEEs. So this diagram depicts what is required for inspection, and we'll talk about the inspections quite a bit in the next many slides. But it starts with what is an EEE. So we're talking about anything any wood element that bears that has wooden supports that extends from the building envelope, hence exterior. So the building envelope, you live in a stucco or sided building. If your deck is recessed within the structure, it's not an EEE. Rather, an EEE is looking at, let's say, the left side of the slide, a cantilever deck off the roof or off of a unit. And yes, this does apply to townhouse complexes as well. So we're talking about decks, balconies, stairways, breezeways, and their railing components as well. Now, we're seeing that in the bottom left corner of the slide, it says that exterior elevated elements that are 72 inches or less above grade level are exempt. So this is, there was a question of where's the 6 feet? You know, where does that start? Well, what we're seeing on the bottom left corner is stairs that are 72 inches or less above grade. So they are not in red because they do not need to be inspected as part of this process. However, if we look to the bottom right corner of the slide with the exterior stairs in red, those are subject to the inspections. And just because the bottom half of that stairway is under 6 feet does not exempt that half of the stairway from inspection. So, you know, if some portion of your exterior elevated element is above 6 feet, the entire element needs to be inspected and is subject to the compliance requirements of SB 326. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that SB 326 applies only to wooden EEEs that bear structural loads. San Francisco and Berkeley have more rigorous requirements. The two notable items that differ from SB 326 are that San Francisco and Berkeley do not differentiate from wood or steel EEEs. So in San Francisco and Berkeley, you need to make sure that your SB 326 inspections are also addressing steel exterior elevated elements. Who can inspect under SB 326? Either a licensed structural engineer or a licensed architect. The code doesn't say that they have to be licensed in California, but that is implied under the laws and regulations that govern engineers and architects. If you're stamping,
Dave, you muted.
Good, thank you. Let me start over on this slide. Under SB 326, only structural engineers and architects licensed in California can perform the inspections. There is, we'll get to it, but there is a report that is issued following the inspection process, and it's stamped, like you see on the right side of the screen, by the architect or engineer. They have to be licensed in California. They can be situated in another state. It's not unusual that architects and engineers have licenses in multiple states, but they have to be licensed in California in order to perform your repairs, despite the fact that SB 326 does not explicitly state that they have to be California licensed. Next, please. Okay, so again, I wanted to go bigger picture before I talk about the details of 326. The Surfside situation, as we'll talk about once we get through this SB 326 process, I anticipate is going to be modeled on the apartment balcony bill and condo balcony bill codes. So when I'm walking you through SB 326, which is the condo balcony bill, I'm doing this as it's analogous to what we're expecting to come out of what I call the ripple effect of legislation in Florida arising from the Surfside collapse. And analogously, again, SB 326 arose out of the balcony collapse in Berkeley. So we're on parallel tracks here on what has to be done as far as exterior elevated elements with associations, and what we are anticipating is going to be implemented in the next handful of years with regard to inspections of the structural cores of the buildings. So the difference is, I'm calling it structural cores to differentiate it from the exterior elements which are outside the building envelope. Okay, so SB 326 requires visual inspection, and you can do it. Your inspector can do it by the least intrusive methods, using moisture meters, borescopes, which are sort of a rod with a camera on the end of it. They're very discreet. They don't require a large opening and stucco or siding, or also infrared technology. That being said, there are certain scenarios where EEEs are buried deep enough or in a configuration behind stucco or siding or shingling or panels where there needs to be an opening so that there can be a bird's eye inspection. SB 326 has wrought quite a bit of controversy about it requires a statistically significant sample, which means a 95% confidence that the results from the sample are reflective of the whole with a margin of error greater than plus or minus 5%. Some people, early on when the bill came out, some people were interpreting this as the equivalent of someone asking you, how do you feel about this meeting tomorrow? And you say, I feel 95% good about it. That's not what this 95% means. This is something that needs to be calculated by a statistician or an engineer or architect who has some level of statistical training. So moving on to the next slide. And just to reiterate again, what we're talking about with SB 326 is strictly wooden elements that support structural loads. So there's a level of logistics / organizing that needs to happen in advance of an SB 326 inspection. The inspector and the contractor who is supporting the investigation need to figure out where the openings are, need to take place, and the size of those openings. Now, there are associations where all of their EEEs are exposed already. For example, the only EEEs are decks and the wooden structural vertical support beams go down to the parking pad below the unit, for example. In those situations, the inspection process is very simple. It's just a matter of getting the inspector up on a ladder to look at the exposed elements. Like I mentioned just a moment ago, though, where the EEEs are under stucco, siding, or any other sort of construction element, they do need to be opened, whether a real small opening to fit a borescope through or a more substantial opening. In the event of more substantial openings, it is a best practice to leave some sort of vent or door when you're putting the when you're covering the opening back up, so that you can just pop those open when you have future inspections. You know, there shouldn't be any cost difference in whether in just covering stucco back up completely versus doing the stucco with a vent. The vent item is not an expensive piece. Next, please. Okay, so when the inspection happens, interestingly enough, this bill is all about the inspection, but the inspection is kind of it's the assumed item in this entire process. The inspectors come out, the openings are already made, or they can just ladder up to an EEE that is exposed to the eye already. They come out, they do the inspection. They're required to prepare a report afterwards that is given to the management company and through the management company to the board. So what happens after the inspection? Well, if the inspector identifies that there are EEEs that present a risk to life and limb, translation to the layperson, there's massive dry rot at stairs, and the inspector has determined that the stairs in their current situation are just not safe. So in that situation, emergency repairs or shoring would be recommended. The shoring typically is just beams that are set under and around the structure that has been flagged as needing emergency repairs, to bolster the connections so that they're safe to leave that exterior elevated element open for use. Under SB 3, back Dave, under SB 326, the inspector is also, I'm not going to say encouraged, but is expected to do further inspections if there is damage identified during their the regular inspection. An example of that would be in a deck situation. I worked on a building down on the peninsula a decade ago, where we identified that one of the decks in EEE, our inspector in that litigation identified that it was not structurally sound and flagged that deck to be shut down until emergency repairs were done. If the inspector under 326 finds that there is a deck or two that have those sorts of conditions, you can expect that they're going to want to look at other decks as well to make sure that it is not a flaw across the entire building's decks, or in the alternate, that it is a flaw, and they need to be doing a substantial investigation to make sure that each and every deck is safe or not safe for use. Ironically, this case I'm mentioning with the deck that was red tagged, it was the same general contractor that built the apartment building in Berkeley that had that catastrophic collapse. Okay. The report, as you'll see, is the third main bullet point here. The inspector is obligated under SB 326 to identify exactly which components were inspected, their condition, the expected future performance and remaining useful life, recommendations for further inspections if needed. Excuse me, that one only applies to the apartments, sorry. And repair recommendations, both emergency and non-emergency. I want to flag the third of the three, the third of the 5 subpoints, expected future performance and remaining useful life, because that's something that is an important topic of conversation that John and Lisa will be talking about in terms of how this SB 326 process also impacts your reserve studies and your reserve funding. Next slide, please. Okay. A differentiation between the apartment bill, which was passed a year before the condominium bill. The apartment bill requires not only that inspections be completed by January 1, 2025, but also that repairs be completed by that date. This is a fraught situation for the apartment ownership community, particularly owners, I call them bulk owners, who have large portfolios of large apartment complexes. This is a big deal for them because the clock's ticking, and if major repairs are required and they have delayed in getting the inspections done, they could have serious issues coming into compliance by January 1, 2025. That's not the case under the condominium bill. The compliance requirement for condominiums is simply that the inspector's report is completed and turned in by January 1, 2025. So it's not going to be a mad dash to get repairs done if they're required. It's going to be more of a mad dash to get the inspections and the reports issued. And I strongly recommend to you, board members, that you start thinking about this now, about getting an inspection scheduled. It doesn't need to be tomorrow, next week, or next month, but next year is a good idea, or the year after. But you certainly don't want to wait until 2014 to get this done. The inspectors, the architects and engineers who do this type of work are going to be booked up, and you may end up with an architect or engineer who is seeing an opportunity under this time crunch that is not necessarily in the business of doing forensic investigations. We're going to see those players coming into the market, and you're best served by going with engineers and architects who are known for their forensic work. So to loop back, those people are going to be booked up in 2014. So start thinking about this now. And also SB 326 is silent, unlike the apartment bill, on the timing of emergency repairs. That being said, that there's no timing requirement, you still have fiduciary obligations and need to follow Davis Sterling and the CC&Rs in terms of protecting the life and limb of the membership of the association in terms of common area EEE, as well as making sure you are protecting the long-term viability of the property, both integrity and value-wise. Next, please. So, like I just mentioned, the initial inspections under SB 326 and their reports turn in must be completed by January 1, 2025, and then every 9 years thereafter, you need to do another SB 326 inspection in coordination with your every 3-year statutorily required reserve study inspections. Next, please. Going to go quickly on this one. I referenced a few slides ago that there is it's not a quick process if you need repairs. This slide is more geared towards this presentation when I'm talking to apartment ownership groups. But very quickly, if you're a large property, if we look at the right column and you need to get, and it turns out you need substantial repairs done, you're looking at a 2 to 3 to 4 year process based on the planning for the inspections, And if there's are problems found, which the second and third substantive columns presume, then you're going to need to do substantive or supplemental inspections, then design, bidding and permitting, and then the repairs. This is it's a long process. Everyone wants to get it right, and that requires quite a bit of time. But to reiterate, SB 326 does not require the repairs to be done by the compliance deadline of January 1, 2025. Next slide. Okay, we're going to talk about the team. Lisa and John are going to talk about the team, about what you do once you have the inspector's report. What this slide speaks to is the team for the actual inspections. Again, you need a registered architect or structural engineer. You're going to need a general contractor, the extent of which is based on the accessibility of your EEEs, as I previously discussed. So, there's a lot of planning and coordinating leading into that. And then there's the report that comes out of that. So, again, it starts from a 0 mile per hour starting point. And as Lisa is going to explain to you, your community association manager is in essence your quarterback for this entire process. They're well qualified to do it. It's this new legislation, fairly new, I should say, SB 326 requirements. What needs to be done is already built into what your community association managers do for you under their regular operating procedures and obligations under the Davis-Sterling Act to guide to make sure the board is appropriately managing and protecting the asset. Next. Okay, this slide I'm going to just breeze through because we're going to get to this when we talk about the team in dealing with handling the report. Your architect or engineer and general contractor are well equipped to provide you with repair options in the event that repairs are required. It's what we do. Again, just like I was saying about property managers, this bill is fairly new, but what it requires is, to put it in candid parlance, it's old hat. This existing building repairs have been going on forever. And with modern buildings, built in the last 50 years, this is what reconstruction contractors like my firm and the engineers and architects we partner with, this is what we do. So what you see on this slide here is a well-trodden path. Next, please. Okay, the finishing up on SB 326, if there are temporary shoring or emergency repairs needed, the engineer does need to report that to the local building authorities within 15 days of making that determination. And then the other two items here I've already spoken to. So next slide. So this is really where we're going to transition over to John and to Lisa. I've mentioned before, the apartment bill requires repairs in addition to a report to be completed by January 1, 2025. The condo balcony bill doesn't. So John and Lisa, John's going to speak to, well, so what do you do without a timing requirement on the repairs? And I'm going to turn over to John from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. So unlike the apartment bill, SB 326 does not give direct guidance on the level of repair required in all circumstances, but we can look to both the Davis-Sterling Act and to an association CC&Rs and the board's compliance with fiduciary duty in terms of steps the board needs to take in response. The board still has clear authority to act in response to the results of an inspection report based on the law and the governing documents. So that first, you want to look to civil code, you want to look to the association CC&Rs that address those components of the development of the condominium development that the association is required to maintain, repair, and replace for the benefit of the members. Second, Civil Code Section 5600 deals with an association's obligation to levy assessments. It says the association shall levy regular and special assessments sufficient to perform its obligations. Of course, if there's a significant assessment increase, there may be a requirement of a member vote in order to raise funds to make non-emergency repairs. You've also got Civil Code Section 5610, 5610B, that gives the board the authority to levy an emergency assessment without a member vote for an extraordinary expense to make repairs for which the association is responsible where a threat to personal safety is discovered. There's another provision of 5610 of the code that allows the board to levy an emergency assessment to make repairs that couldn't have been anticipated when the prior budget was distributed and can't wait until the distribution of the next budget to incorporate into assessment increases. Generally speaking, if you have a true emergency situation and a threat to personal safety that requires immediate action, the board may have the ability to levy an emergency assessment. You would need to consult with the association's legal counsel to get a legal opinion to provide the board with the authority and the cover and the expert advice the board would need in order to take that extraordinary step. And then finally, I spoke at the end of the last presentation about fiduciary duty. The board has the authority to rely on the advice of experts as part of its reasonable inquiry. All of this goes to say that when the board receives recommendations from the inspector that repairs are needed, even of a non-emergency nature, the board needs to take those things into account and begin the planning process for the performance of those repairs and the budgeting of those repairs, which leads me to my final point on this. Civil Code Section 5551, which is how SB 326 was codified and put into the Civil Code, also requires that the inspection results and what's in the report be incorporated into the association's reserve study. So you do need to begin budgeting to meet the repair obligations that arise from the report. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for a minute to talk about on the next slide, the next couple of slides, the role of the board of directors and the role of the community association manager. And before I turn it over, I'm having issues hearing based on my computer setup situation. So the interplay we might otherwise have may be lacking. But Lisa, I know you've got the next couple of slides talking about the board and the manager.
Okay, thanks, John and David. Obviously, the first thing to do is comply with the law. Clearly, that's the first area that we need to proceed in. And while we all want to make sure we're complying with the law, the other thing is to make sure that you're always following the business judgment rule and doing your due diligence. So it's comparing or making those companion pieces as we move forward. And the reason I bring that up is because obviously right now with SB 326, we are faced with specific things that we as associations, board members have to perform now. But if we can actually start implementing and making sure that we are aligning with the business judgment rule, then at least we can make sure we're building a foundation so that when these kinds of things come up, it isn't such a shoot in the foot process where we have to proceed. So, but first thing, comply with the law. Accurate budgeting, obviously. Now you know that you should be looking at your financials on a monthly basis, working closely with your reserve analyst. This has come up. We'll probably talk about this a little bit more in depth, but your reserve analyst is compiling the information that you need to make sure that you're maintaining the components. and that reserve analyst is key to your team. So reserve studies, make sure that you've got those on your agendas and you are actually looking at them. I've noticed that there are lots of associations where they'll sort of as a courtesy rubber stamp that reserve study, but not recognize that most all reserve studies will actually break down what the lifespan is for the individual components. Definitely need to be paying attention to those, and your management team should help you in that direction. Communicating with your members, really important. Don't keep this necessarily just at the board level. We know that all regular board sessions are open, but we also know that as a rule, not with every association, but as a rule, there's a lot of apathy. Your owners aren't necessarily coming to your meetings to find out what is critical and what is coming down the pike, nor are they reading necessarily the information that is being sent out in newsletters. This is a particularly important issue. And so looking at different ways to communicate with your community and actually getting them to invest in this process. Being a part of the first seminar with Professor Kaufman and John Gill, he was talking about the width of a crack, reporting water leaks. I mean, I know working in the industry, sometimes you've got individuals who will call and report things consistently, and you can kind of chalk them up to maybe being a complainer. You don't want to go there anymore. Take every complaint or issue or report with importance and do the due diligence so that you can have a clear foundation of performing your scope, your authority, and the business judgment rule. John, do you want to talk more about not interfering with inspectors' decision-making? Because that's important. John Gill? Okay, well, let me start. Anytime you're working with a vendor, anybody that's coming on as a person who is in that authority position with the expertise and the skills to either perform an inspection, provide a service, do not engage in trying to affect their decision-making. This can critically impact your D&O insurance because, again, that professional, and I know I'm speaking to the choir with ECHO members because you're all pretty savvy, but again, it bears repeating that you want to let that professional do their job because they have the liability at that point, and you don't want to interfere. So,
Lisa, if I
yes,
could
please
add
do.
to that, and I apologize for whatever reason the sound coming to me is breaking up, but I understand we're on the last bullet point here. The big I want to make here goes back to fiduciary duty. And I believe Lisa was making it from a management perspective. Let me be really blunt here. I have dealt with board members that get inspection proposals from architects and engineers that explain what the inspector believes is necessary to comply with Civil Code Section 5551, and boards push back based on cost considerations, disruption, and what have you, and want to negotiate the scope of necessary testing and inspections to comply with the law. Just as board members want to be able to rely on independent expert advice and follow it to protect the board members from personal liability, and we've talked previously about board members not acting as the experts, this is the worst possible scenario. If the board pushes back and says, we're only going to authorize a third of what the inspector proposes, you're going to have a horrible situation where either A, the inspector says, I won't do it, or B, the inspector writes a report and says, we weren't permitted to do what we recommended to comply with the law, none of which helps the association, none of which complies with the law, and none of which protects the board members. If the board doesn't like the scope of the inspection and the initial proposed in the initial proposal, get a second opinion about what's necessary. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But if the board gets in the business of trying to negotiate the scope of investigation downward to save money, it's really the worst possible scenario. What the board needs at the end of all of this is an inspection report that makes clear that the inspection fully complied with the requirements of Civil Code Section 5551 so that the board can rely on it for the protection of residents. If you have a balcony collapse and it comes back that the board didn't want to pay the cost to do what was necessary to comply with the law, you have the disaster of the collapse and you have the disaster of individual director liability. So when we say don't interfere with the inspector's decision-making, this is not a negotiation. You can always get a second opinion, but you don't want to negotiate with your inspector that you need to rely on.
Thanks, John. I think we're good with the next slide. All right. Educating board members, obviously following closely with what ECHO provides will keep you with the information you need to better perform and also to make the best decisions. At the end of the day, the team that you work with is incredibly important. So a recommendation would be at the beginning of your fiscal year, make sure that you have your attorney in to do a presentation, make sure you're looking at your reserve study, whatever hasn't been done from a deferred perspective to what is set to be done, and make sure you're getting those inspections. So those would be some of the things to definitely do from an educating perspective of board members, is getting these kinds of functions set up on an annual basis so you can make sure that you're performing what you should be doing, and include your team. And that does include your insurance broker. So these are key people that you want to have on direct dial as a board. And that kind of leads into bringing experts and legal counsel to the board. Whether you have experience or not, when you sit on a board, you have your board hat. So you do want to make sure that you are working with industry professionals on various aspects of the association management for what John and David have talked about. Mitigating liability is certainly one, and your D&O insurance is another. Coordinating communications with your inspector, contractor, and board members. I'm a real advocate of keeping it as transparent as possible. I know how tough it is to work in this industry nowadays as a board member, much more challenging than it was even 10 years ago. You live and you represent millions of dollars worth of asset as you sit on a board, and yet the home is a very personal thing. Your community is very personal. So having to make decisions that you know are going to disrupt the social fabric can be really, really challenging. Again, another reason why you want to align closely with your professional experts and use them. From a communication standpoint, set up a plan where you are communicating consistently in a variety of ways, simply because nowadays it's not just the newsletter, but it's text and it's e-blast. And but for things that are important in the association, make sure that you are disseminating consistently. And if you can provide some social functions where you get other people involved, any way that you can disseminate important kinds of information, take the extra steps to do that, because having a community that is well informed, even if they're not in agreement, is still a better place to be. I know that we've also talked about the accurate budgeting. Clearly very, very important. Make sure that you are paying attention to the budget and the budget that is set forth for whatever particular project you're doing, and be transparent about that as well. John, did you have any more comments on the budgeting part? I don't want to gloss over it, but I want to make sure that I'm addressing.
So with regard to the assurances of safety, seeing this comes up, whether it's somebody calling the association's manager or somebody running into a board member in the parking lot. It's not unusual when people members start getting wind that something's up with inspections, and we're doing balcony structural inspections, for people to get scared. And human nature says we try and put people at ease with, no, this is totally normal, nothing to worry about. You want to be guarded in what you say. Anytime we give someone an assurance of safety, there is a risk that if something goes wrong, they're going to come back and say, you assured me I had nothing to worry about, and now my spouse got hurt because the balcony collapsed. So what I intend by avoid assurances of safety is when somebody asks, should we be worried? How bad is this? The answer is the law requires us to do these inspections. We're hiring qualified licensed inspectors, and we're going to follow the advice and the recommendations that they give us. You really need to resist the urge to say, oh, there's nothing to worry about this. This is just the people in Sacramento telling us what to do again. This isn't about how we feel. It's about complying with the law and protecting the residents and protecting the property. So you really want to be guarded in how you present that when somebody asks the question, should I be worried? Are we at risk? The answer is, we're going to be told what we need to do and whether there's anything to be concerned about, and leave it at that. So I think we can go next slide. In the interest of time, I think we're down to the last couple minutes before we do question and answer. So the role of legal counsel. First, we routinely are called on, and I would encourage all board members to go to the association's legal counsel to find out exactly what it is we need to have inspected that is consistent with the association's maintenance and repair obligations. The way this comes up most often is sometimes balconies are treated as exclusive use common area. And depending on what your CC&R say, the exclusive use common area may have owner maintenance and repair responsibilities, while the association has other maintenance and repair obligations. From my perspective, the structural supports, which is what the inspection is all about, are in all likelihood going to be an association obligation, but determining the association's maintenance and repair obligations is essential. You need a legal opinion on that, and it may require not only a review of the governing documents, but the condominium plan, because we're dealing with condominiums. And the recorded condominium plan should specifically spell out who's responsible for what. It is hard to imagine a scenario where the association wouldn't be responsible for the inspection and repair of balcony structural shortcomings based on this law, but you should get a legal opinion to make sure you're fully conversant with it. Legal disclosures that come up with this, legal counsel should be consulted on. The negotiation and preparation of inspector and contractor, construction contracts, both for the destructive testing for the inspections as needed and for eventually repairs. And again, back to the inspector contract, the most important thing from my perspective to be sure is included in the inspector's contractual obligations is an obligation to write a report confirming that the inspection performed by the inspector fully complies with the requirements of Civil Code Section 5551, which is SB 326. And then assisting with the association's financing options, funding options. That brings us to the next slide, actually. So what are your options to get the money to do what's necessary? Well, first, if you're not already funding your reserves with the costs of the necessary inspection prior to January 1, 2025, you should be. Inspections and repairs are reserve expenses. It's part of the maintenance, repair, and replacement of the common area components that are the association's responsibility. And you need to be building these things into reserves. There isn't a lot of time now, but certainly going forward, you want to make sure that's covered. You want to ensure that your reserve funds are liquid. If you have a potential, if you may have $100,000 expense, depending on the size of your community, between the cost of the inspector and the cost of the contractor, to evaluate 100 balconies and some elevated walkways and elevated stair landings. It's not enough to have the money in reserves. You need to make sure you have the funds liquid at the time that, for example, if a CD is expiring, you don't just want to roll it over, you want to keep it liquid. There's always the option for a special assessment, or if you're told there's an imminent risk of harm, there's the option of an emergency assessment. You want to consult with legal counsel. If you have a significant major reconstruction project arising out of the first inspections, which I think with some older communities, we're going to see more of than we would hope, but that's the whole purpose of the bill, to protect against what we don't know for something going wrong. A bank loan or a line of credit could enable the association to get the repair funds now, supported by a special assessment of the members that's payable over an extended repayment period that could be 5, 7, 10 years, to make it more manageable from a cash flow perspective from the members, while allowing the association to obtain the necessary repair funds immediately. And then finally, we were talking this morning regarding the issue of construction defects. If you have a condominium development under 10 years of age, there are developer and builder liability issues if there is a problem with the construction of any portion of the development. Balconies are one of the #1 culprits we encounter in construction defect claims. Because of the way they're built, they are very susceptible to water intrusion and resulting damage. So if your condominium community is under 10 years of age, you want to be looking to the builders to shoulder any of the costs related to the repair of construction defects. And it is routine in today's scenario for legal counsel to handle construction defect investigations and claims on a contingency basis, where the law firm advances the costs of the inspection so the association can get its inspection report with funds advanced by legal counsel for the purpose of making a claim against the developer. So if you're under 10 years old, you absolutely should consult with legal counsel to see what your options are in that regard. And then finally, the last slide, disclosure issues. Annual reserve funding disclosures. As I said, the results of these inspections and the inspector reports need to be incorporated into the association's reserve analysis. And the association has an annual reserve funding disclosure and reserve funding plan under Civil Code Section 5560 and 5570 is the annual funding disclosure summary that is submitted with the annual budget report. You want to ask your reserve study specialist to either assist you or take over filling out that disclosure summary that accounts for the results of the inspection and the need for any necessary future repairs that are incorporated into the reserve fund or the reserve study. The inspector's reports, the law does not say they have to be made available to the members. Yet, it wouldn't surprise me if that becomes a legal obligation. The flip side is if you're being transparent with your members and you want to show the members, here's the problem we have, that's something the board should discuss with legal counsel about whether these inspector reports should be made available to the members, maybe not with a photocopy, but certainly the ability for the members to access them in some protected fashion so the members fully understand and appreciate what the big deal is and why the board is saying we need to take action and raise money to make repairs. Similarly, escrow demands on the sale of units. Lisa would certainly be familiar with this. And so I'll close. I'm going to turn this over to you a little bit, Lisa. With the sale of every unit, you get an escrow demand and a lender questionnaire asking a number of questions. It wouldn't surprise me if your lender questionnaires and your escrow demands begin to ask the question, has the association obtained its SB 326 Civil Code Section 5551 inspection report? I don't know if that's something your company has talked about at this point, but would you foresee getting asked that question? And is that something you would foresee the need to speak with boards about and legal counsel about in terms of how it ought to be handled?
Absolutely. And along with those pieces, they are usually requesting copies of minutes and communications such as newsletters. So that information is getting out, but I would assume that there needs to be a little bit more regulated fashion so that owners are aware or potential buyers. So in agreement with what you've said.
So with that, I believe we've come to the end of the presentation. Connor, I'm not sure if Connor or Dave Zapponi will be leading question and answer.
It will be me. And so thank you for that. We have just a few minutes, like 5 minutes to take Q&A in this segment. So I'll ask you to, all the attendees, to put their questions in the chat room at this time. And I will take the first. There was a question about just confirmation of what types of buildings are under this particular balcony inspection rule. In particular, one of the questions was, are townhomes considered, or do they need to be inspected?
Yes.
John or Lisa?
Yes, absolutely. The townhome is just a style. That's not necessarily a designation in your governing documents typically. But as David talked, when you're talking about your EEE or your EEE, whether you're San Francisco or Oakland or whatever, it is the wood and our metal components, right? So townhomes may have that as well.
Okay.
If the issue here is townhomes being covered, again, I apologize, my sound is off. The distinction of townhome, a townhouse is an architectural style, a 2-story or 3-story unit. You can have townhouse style condominiums. You can have townhouse style planned developments. The law applies to condominiums. So the irony here is you can have companion projects that look like they're phase 1 and phase 2, virtually identical in all respects across the street from each other. One is mapped for condominium, one is mapped as a planned development. The way SB 326 is written, development isn't covered, even though it's built the same and has the same features. I would expect that to be changed in the future, but right now we're dealing with condominiums. And there are many, many, many condominiums that are townhouse style. So the issue here isn't, is it a townhouse? Is it mapped for condominium? And that is absolutely, well, you'd have a condominium plan and your CC&Rs would reference condominiums and units, as opposed to in a planned development, it probably refers to lots and residences.
Okay, and it's in a PUD or planned unit development is not under the jurisdiction of this or covered by this law. Okay,
Not
that
yet.
sounds good. Yeah, not yet. Okay, yeah, probably that. Yeah, right. It'll be changed. The next question is about steel versus wood elements. This law only applies. One of the questions was it only applies to wood elements. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, unless you are in Berkeley or San Francisco. That's
Okay.
simple.
So local ordinances may or code may affect whether you are covered or not, or you're responsible for
Whether steel's required as well. Yes, David.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's go to the questions here. I'm going to pop on down to the bottom. How does an HOA find an independent inspector who is not connected with an engineering or construction firm who also bids on the project? So, to solve the problem, it's sort of this tied house problem. An inspector of a construction firm or an engineering firm, an architect perhaps, is connected somehow to that. How do you navigate those waters to make sure that they're being independent?
Well, certainly in your vetting process, there are individual engineers that work by themselves, not necessarily aligned with a construction firm. So it's just a matter of vetting when you're looking for that kind of professional.
Okay, and let's see, Lauren asks. Okay, so it refers here to condominium developments are cooperative corporations included in the condominium identification?
Dave, the question is whether co-ops are included.
Yes.
A co-op that is not mapped for condominium. Right now, this applies specifically to condominium buildings with 3 or more separate dwelling units, is the way the law is written. So if there's a scenario where there's a condominium plan for a building that has a co-op form of ownership, it may apply. That is a question you would want to ask legal counsel to evaluate whether the law applies at all.
Okay, and then there's just a very specific question here about how do you measure, or where do you start the measurement of your 6 foot qualifying requirement for above for the structural elements? What's the
Well, I would say, if referring back to that diagram early on in the slideshow, that if any portion, it showed, if you remember, in the bottom left-hand corner, there were stairs that were not outlined in red because they were 72 inches or less off the ground. You might recall that the ground actually sloped up underneath the stairs. So there's the law doesn't provide any guidance on this, but a fair interpretation would be if any point of your EEE is 72 inches above the ground directly below it, then it's within SB 326.
Okay. And so
Because what again, the law doesn't explain why, but the reason is, 72 inches is a 6-foot fall. And 73 inches is that much more of a fall. So they're protecting, it appears they're protecting against the height of the fall.
Okay. Okay, well, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and go into the Q&A chat room sessions. We will now move into the breakout chat rooms. A reminder, you will be able to move between chat rooms by hovering over the Zoom option bar and selecting the breakout room icon. Once selected, you may then pick the chat room you wish to join from the list. You may switch chat rooms as often as you like. Our speakers for this session will be in the Sarman Construction breakout chat room. Great. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our third session and last session of the day, Legal Resource Panel Update, presented by Mark Walensky, Esquire. He's the panel chair. Mark Walensky serves as General Counsel to community associations for day-to-day activities, including the Davis-Sterling Act, interpretation of governing documents, review of proposed contracts, and resolution of board and owner disputes. He also works on claims for construction defects, budget shortfalls, and insurance coverage. Mark has focused on community associations since 1980. He established his law firm in 1986. Mark, you may begin.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the program. Thank you for attending. My name is Mark Walensky, and I am the chair of the ECHO Legal Resource Panel. Today, we are going to review new cases, opinions from the Court of Appeal and trial court verdicts and settlements. Can I please have my PowerPoint slide posted on the ECHO screen? First PowerPoint slide. There we go. You may have think that the pandemic has caused the courts to slow down, and it is true. There has been various impacts on various courts throughout the state. But make no mistake about it, the courts and the legislature have been active regarding community associations, generally making your life more difficult. And as you've heard for the first 2 hours, things are likely to get even more difficult into the future. What can you do to protect yourself? The answer is to learn new developments and follow what's going on in the courts and legislature, services provided by ECHO. And I would like to ask for a big virtual round of applause for Dave and Connor Zapponi and all our speakers today. The program is going to work off of PowerPoint slides. Here we are on the first slide. In a review of what we're going to be talking about, recent opinions from the Court of Appeal. The first case is going to talk about individual owners being exempt from any restrictions on rentals not in place at the time of purchase of that unit. The second case will be to talk about restrictions imposed by a developer to try to stop lawsuits for construction defects, and a recent code section that prohibits such developer activity. The third case is going to be talking about parking limits within HOAs and whether that gives a duty to protect visitors who have to park off-site. The fourth case, we'll talk about iPhone or Nest security systems that have become very popular. And what is the legal test for that being or becoming an invasion of privacy? The fifth case, we'll talk about class action based on false advertising and how class actions on false advertising differ from the requirements for other class actions. The sixth case, we'll talk about being the prevailing party to win legal fees from the other side in a dispute involving an HOA and its members. Assuming you are the prevailing party, how do you prove your fees? The seventh case, we'll talk about using attorney invoices as evidence. The eighth case is going to talk about short-term vacation rental bans in Santa Barbara and the role and requirements of the Coastal Commission. The Santa Barbara rules were deemed void because they didn't comply with Coastal Commission requirements. Then we're going to move to the trial courts and talk about verdicts and settlements ranging from an $11 million swimming pool result for the plaintiff to defense verdicts or settlements where the plaintiff gets nothing. Next slide, please. The first case we're going to talk about is Brown versus Montage at Mission Hills. This is regarding exempting owners from rental restrictions. As you know, VRBO, Airbnb, and a variety of other online services have resulted in a lot of short-term rentals, including homeowner associations, and associations are pushing back against that. This concerns Civil Code 4740 and 4741. Here's what happened. Unit owner buys a unit in 2002. At that time, Montage had no limits on renting or other types of minimum duration requirements for rentals in the HOA. And so the plaintiff performed short-term rentals from 2002 to 2017. But in 2018, the Homeowner Association amended the CC&Rs to prohibit short-term rentals less than 30 days. The plaintiff, Brown, who had been renting from 2002 to 2017, said they couldn't do that and filed suit in court, citing Civil Code 4740. So what does 4740 say? It's pretty simple. Let me just read it to you. Civil Code 4740A, an owner of a separate interest, unit owner, in a common interest development shall not be subject to a provision in a governing document that prohibits the rental or leasing of the separate interest unless that restriction in the governing documents was effective before the date the owner acquired title. So the owner says, I got title in 02. There were no limits. Under 4740, you can't impose them on me now. The trial court said the HOA wins, the owner loses. Why? The trial court said, this is a restriction of under 30-day rentals. It is not a prohibition. The statute refers to governing documents that prohibit rental or leasing. This is not a prohibition, so the owner loses, the HOA can go ahead and restrict rentals. The Court of Appeal reverses. It starts off by going through legislative history for 4740 and concludes that restricting rentals under 30 days is a prohibition of those rentals covered by the statute. So because the unit owner Brown was not subject to rental restrictions at the time the plaintiff purchased the unit, those restrictions of any kind cannot be imposed now. No restrictions, no limitations. Next slide. Smart Owner HOA versus CJUF Smart Corner, its developer. This is a Court of Appeal decision that is in favor of an HOA suing the developer for construction defects. In short, the defendant developer is working hard to avoid construction defect claim liability. The developer writes the CC&Rs, so there is a requirement that the entire membership of the association must approve claims against the developer by a 51% vote or more, or the defect suit cannot be filed. And if it is filed without that vote, it's void. That's what it says in the CC&Rs. Furthermore, the developer has its architect certify substantial completion that was really before substantial completion. Several building inspections failed after the so-called substantial completion. But substantial completion triggers the 10-year statute of limitation. And in this case, it was just between the architect's substantial completion and the actual substantial completion. And the question was whether the 10-year statute expired. This case concerns a 19-story mixed-use condos in San Diego. They sued the developer. They forgot to take a member vote before filing suit. The developer moved for summary judgment and won. The trial court dismissed all the claims. The HOA lost. The developer won. Then the HOA appeals to the Court of Appeal. Then the legislature enacts Civil Code 5986, which says pre-litigation voting rules to legitimize claims against the developer, that's void. The language is pretty broad. Here's what 5986 says. Quote, the governing documents shall not impose any preconditions or limitations on the board's authority to commence and pursue a civil lawsuit or arbitration or any other legal proceeding against a developer. Any limitation or precondition, including but not limited to requiring a member vote as a prerequisite, is unenforceable, null, and void. The failure to comply with those limitations or preconditions not only is void, but it shall not even be asserted as a defense by the developer. That's pretty broad. And it's retroactive. Even though the case was dismissed before the appeal, the statute is retroactive. So the Court of Appeal reversed the trial court, the HOA wins. Advanced member voting rules in the CC&Rs are against public policy in Civil Code 5986, and they are also found to be unconscionable and unreasonable. The recent case of Aldea dos Vientos versus Cal Atlantic reaches the same conclusion. The previous case before that, which led to this statute, Branches Neighborhood, which said the HOA lost without a member vote, is rejected. So it's an effort by the legislature to protect HOAs and defect claims against the developer, which are even more important to consider now because of the Florida collapse. Next slide, please. This is the case of Issaquah versus Shadow Glen HOA. The plaintiff is a visitor coming to the HOA to visit a friend. Plaintiff finds no available parking for visitors. So plaintiff has to park off-site on a 5-lane highway, jaywalks across the highway, is hit by a car, brain injury, skull fracture, didn't bother to use a marked crosswalk several hundred feet away. This is Sun Valley, California. It recently passed rezoning, which required guest spaces at this condominium. The city's certificate of occupancy for this condominium required 170 parking spaces. But when the plaintiff was injured, 6 spaces were marked for visitors, violating both the city ordinance and the certificate of occupancy. Plaintiff says this is a violation of statute, negligence per se. The defendant doesn't even get to claim they weren't negligent because they violated the statute. That's too bad. Plaintiff loses. Both the trial court and the Court of Appeal support the HOA. The visitor's injury is not the HOA liability. Why? Because the ordinance and the certificate of occupancy only go to if the plaintiff is in a class to be protected. And the injury is the type of injury the statutes were designed to protect. The Court of Appeal says this is about protecting the residential nature of the neighborhood. It is not about creating parking for every visitor who wants to park. California courts, as cases were cited, has a history of not setting a duty of care for an owner based on alleged lack of on-site parking. So the requirement of parking stalls for owners in the project does not protect a visitor who jaywalks across an adjacent street. That plaintiff was injured. Sounds terrible, but they do not have a claim of recovery against the HOA. Make no mistake, the HOA still must maintain its on-site property to watch for traffic hazards, such as landscaping that blocks stop signs or views. Those other requirements for on-site maintenance still apply. Next slide, please. Mesger versus Bick. The plaintiff is an owner of a single-family residence in an HOA. The defendant is the plaintiff's neighbor that has an iPhone and a Nest recording security video. The neighbor doing the recording says they have been subject to safety threats and other problems that require security, and that this system is just for their own personal security. The plaintiff says, no, that's not what's going on here. The defendant doesn't like plaintiff's use of their property. Defendant says the plaintiff is making too much noise, had their grandkids over in the pool, made a bunch of noise in the backyard. They're trying to generate proof of improper noise conduct by the next door neighbor. The problem for the owner being recorded is California law. The Court of Appeal affirms a trial court decision based on California law that intrusion into privacy must be highly offensive to a reasonable person. Here, the trial court reviewed 15 videos that the plaintiffs got from the defendants in discovery. The trial court concluded that the defendant's recording of the plaintiff next door was only incidental or insubstantial. Second bullet point there, it only shows a small part of the plaintiff's yard, and plaintiff's conversations were inaudible. If the plaintiff elevated volume, made a bunch of noise in their backyard, they cannot expect privacy from that. So the plaintiff lost everything, right? Nope. Last bullet point. During the course of this lawsuit, the defendants moved out. They sold the home before the opinion in this case, but the Court of Appeal said the fact they moved out is irrelevant. We're still ruling on this case, and the rule is highly offensive to a reasonable person. So, do you want to record your neighbor across the hall? Do you want to set up a doorbell camera to watch what happens? You don't care about who's coming to your door, only what's happening to your neighbor. Do you win or do you lose when the neighbor sues for invasion of privacy? It all depends on whether your doorbell camera is recording in a way that's highly offensive to a reasonable person. Next slide, please. Peviani versus Arbor at California Oaks property. This is a condominium. I'm sorry. The defendant is an apartment complex in Murrieta, California. 460 units. The plaintiffs are tenants that want to bring a class action. It's too difficult and expensive and time consuming for every single owner, tenant, to try to make a claim against the apartments. So they try to bring two class actions. The first class action claims false advertising and habitability violations. The second class action involves misconduct in the defendant keeping apartment security deposits. In the trial court, the apartments win. The trial court says class action requires commonality. Everybody's got a different unit, they've got a different experience with the apartments, no commonality, no class action. Court of Appeal reverses. This is a false advertising class action, not a fraud class action. For the false advertising claims to prevail, it only requires that the plaintiffs show representations made by the defendant that where the public is likely to be deceived. The plaintiffs do not need to show each member of the class was victim of actual deception or reasonably relied. If the statements are shown to be likely to deceive the public, reasonable reliance is assumed. Let me just read to you briefly what the plaintiffs alleged as tenants. Quote, this is from the opinion. Plaintiffs allege defendants' brochure, the brochure, showed renovated interiors, quality plush carpeting, sparkling swimming pools, heated spas, cabanas, and lounges, a tennis basketball court, a fitness center, a rock climbing wall, community game room, Wi-Fi cafe, picnic area, dog park, playground, and garden, car wash area, central heating, and air conditioning. The website of defendant further showed glistening pools, manicured gardens, etc. Granite countertops, hardwood floors, full-size washer dryers. The plaintiffs alleged all of that was false, that in reality, the carpeting was not plush. One named class representative had mushrooms growing out of the carpet, fitness equipment dirty and broken, swimming pools dirty and diseased, hot tubs green with algae, assigned parking not enforced, 48-hour maintenance not kept, violence, crime, and drug use in the common areas in the barbecue, playground, and dog park. that the units were not smoke-free and the water connection to the car wash was not functioning. Trash emitted a foul odor. Common areas had dog feces, used condoms, garbage, and rodents. So these plaintiffs would have an almost insurmountable task to prove a class action for each one of them as a member of the class. But by raising false advertising claims, they proved they were likely to be deceived. Now, in exchange, there is a trade-off. If you sue for false advertising, the only thing you can recover, the only remedy, is restitution or injunction. So if you paid rent, you may get restitution. If you want to stop these misstatements, you might get an injunction. Next slide. Champier versus Fairbanks Ranch Association. This is regarding recovery of attorney's fees. Here, this association is in Rancho Santa Fe, San Diego County. The HOA passes a special assessment, $5.3 million, to improve common areas, including adding traffic signals on HOA entrances, gates 1 and 6. But when they built out the improvements, the permission from the county was granted for gates 2 and 6, not 1 and 6. So the plaintiffs, of course, live right at the entrance to gate 2. They file a lawsuit in court and say, association defendant, you did not get owner approval to build traffic signals at entrance 2. If you want to do that, you have to have a vote of the membership to allow it, because your past vote didn't do it. The trial court says, I'm going to enter a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order to force the HOA to follow its voting rules. So the HOA did exactly that, held a vote again, and guess what? The traffic signal at gate number 2 is approved. The case is dismissed from court. Both sides ask for attorney's fees from the other as the prevailing party. The HOA says, we won. We got our traffic signal. The owners say, we won. We forced you to hold a vote required by the governing documents in the civil code. The trial court says, the owners are right. All they wanted was a vote. They didn't sue to stop ever the placement of the traffic signals. They only wanted a vote. So the association paid the owners $112,000 from the trial court. The Court of Appeal affirms and adds the fees for the plaintiff in the Court of Appeal. So the rule here is follow your CC&Rs. If you get sued in court to force you to follow your CC&Rs, you're likely to end up having to follow them and pay attorney's fees to the owners who prevail on forcing you to do things right. Let's go to the next slide, please. My versus HKT Cal Inc. Okay, you've won an award of attorneys. Oh, can you back up one slide, please? There's one more thing. The procedure approved in this case is really important for anyone involved in HOA litigation that wants attorney's fees. Here at the bottom, the plaintiff, after it won the vote, the plaintiff dismissed the suit, then moved to recover its fees, then after the recovery, entered judgment against the HOA. But wait, how can you do that? The case is dismissed. Doesn't the court have no jurisdiction to decide on the prevailing party after the case is dismissed? This case, Champier, says it approves this procedure. You do not have to file a second lawsuit to recover the fees after dismissal. You don't have to set aside the dismissal to move for fees. You can get the case dismissed in court and then move for fees and judgment, even if the case is dismissed. That's way benefit to whoever gets their attorney's fees. Next slide, please. So you win attorney's fees. How do you prove it? How do you prove the amount of attorney's fees you're entitled to? Well, the traditional way is you have the attorney testify or swear in a declaration that this work was done, these bills were issued, and the prevailing party paid the bills. In this case, the demand for fees comes during trial as a part of damages, not as a post-trial motion. So the defendant during trial objects to the attorney's fees bills presented by plaintiff, who wants them recovered, because they're hearsay. The bills were issued by someone else, not plaintiff, and whether or not they were true and what was done is all hearsay. In this trial, in my trial, the attorney for the claimant wanting attorney's fees offered to take the witness stand and present the bills. The trial court said, no, you can't do that. You're not on the witness list. Your bills were not part of discovery. So I'm not going to allow you as attorney for the claimant to testify in court. The Court of Appeal reversed the whole thing and said there's an exception to the hearsay regarding attorney's fees. The plaintiff or party paying the bill can testify. They received the bill, they paid the bill. That's evidence that the bill was reasonable. And regarding what was done in the bill, you don't have to call the attorney as a witness to explain everything they did in generating those fees. You can ask the court to take judicial notice of what happened in that court to prove what was done and how much was charged for it. That should make everything a lot easier for people claiming attorney's fees. Let's move along to the next case. Slide, please. Cracky versus the City of Santa Barbara. This involves the Coastal Commission. If you have a property that's under the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission, there are severe restrictions on changes to that property. You have to be in the coastal zone. That's what's governed by the Coastal Commission. And if you are in the coastal zone, you have to make sure you're complying with Coastal Commission requirements. What is the coastal zone? It's 3 miles out to sea, and then eastbound, to a degree that varies. It is measured from the high tide line. It's a few hundred feet on shore in urban areas, up to 5 miles in rural areas, under the control of the Coastal Commission. Well, why does that matter? Because if you are in the coastal zone, anything you do that is a development, as that term is defined, requires a coastal development permit. Well, what is a development that requires a coastal development permit? For an HOA, for the City of Santa Barbara, for anybody. What is a development? It's just about anything. Any demolition, construction, replacement to a structure, grading, removal, replacement of rock and soil, clearing vegetation, impeding access to the beach, altering property lines, and here's the kicker, changing the intensity of use. That's exactly what the City of Santa Barbara did here. They banned short-term vacation rentals. That changed the use of the coastal zone. It required a permit, a coastal development permit from the Coastal Commission before the change took place. Wasn't done, so the trial court issued an injunction against the city of Santa Barbara, meaning they cannot enforce their short-term rental ban because it's a development that changes intensity of the use unless you get a coastal development permit first. If you are in a coastal zone and you want to do anything that requires a permit from the Coastal Commission, I urge you to don't do anything until you find a lawyer who specializes in Coastal Commission procedures. Next slide, please. Now we're going on to trial court verdicts and settlements from the Court of Appeal. Now we're down in the trial court. $11 million against an HOA. 11 million. The plaintiff was visiting his father's condominium, jumped in the pool, spinal cord fracture, paralyzed, quadriplegia. If a plaintiff is dead, there are limitations on the amount the heirs can recover. If a plaintiff is going to survive years and years and decades into the future, the damages are going to really skyrocket because you've got to care for that plaintiff. And that's what happened here. They had a great expert witness who basically challenged all the requirements about a swimming pool. The pool was configured counterintuitively. It was deep where it should have been shallow. It was shallow where it should have been deep. There were no diving signs that were required by regulation, and a whole variety of technical violations of regulations on swimming pools. So the quadriplegic plaintiff sued the HOA, the property manager, and the pool maintenance company. Plaintiff had $275,000 in quadriplegia medical bills. Future bills were estimated at $20 million. Lost future income, 20-year-old man, working life 50 years or more, $2 million. Settled at $11 million. If you have a swimming pool at your HOA, how much liability insurance do you have? Should you have 11 million? This looks like it may be so. Furthermore, what about these brand new online property pool rental sites, Airbnb for swimming pools? You are a single family homeowner. You want to let somebody come in and use your pool for the afternoon for a couple hours. Is that a good idea? What if they jump in and become a quadriplegic? What if you don't have the right no diving signs? What if you violate a variety of other regulations? Also, if you open your swimming pool to the public in your backyard, do you now have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Do you have to have a lift so that disabled swimmers can get lifted into the pool behind your house? A lot of questions. But it now appears that, at least in Orange County, lawyers have decided that a 20-year-old man with quadriplegia is entitled to $11 million worth of damages. Let's go to the right side of the same slide. 7.6 million to a husband and wife couple, Garcia, against a manager and against an apartment. The plaintiffs are on-site managers with a rent-free apartment in Canoga Park, 81 units. Defendants are the apartment owners and the management company for the apartments. The plaintiff couple was asked to leave the apartments and give up their rent-free apartment and terminated as managers. Why? They allegedly had some treatment for medical conditions that interfered with their ability to manage the apartments. This is classic FEHA on the state level, Fair Employment and Housing Act. This is ADA. Was there an effort to accommodate the disability? The short summary doesn't mention that. All it says is the plaintiffs were terminated for medical conditions where they say they could have still performed all their duties. Jury verdict for plaintiffs against the apartment and the manager, 7.6 million. Do you have 7.6 million in liability insurance for your management company? Next slide, please. 1.1 million, Schwartz versus Ragsdale. This is a fairly, it appears to be garden variety. Plaintiff buys a home, 1.1 million in Orange County. First rain, remember when we used to have rain? First rain, the house leaks like a sieve. The plaintiff buyer says there was no disclosure of severe water leaks at roof decks, windows, and balconies. The new buyer who suffered all these leaks says the seller brought in an unlicensed contractor to do repairs that didn't work. The leaks just kept on coming and there were no permits taken. So the seller stipulates to liability, goes to arbitration. The arbitration is award confirmed by the clerk. I'm sorry, the arbitration award is confirmed by the court, Superior Court, 1.1 million. Right side, 1 million, Beacons Beach Triad LLC versus Ruckel. Again, the plaintiff is a developer, 3 new single-family residences being built. The defendant is the general contractor and its subcontractors. The builder alleges defects in framing, plumbing, roofing, HVAC, and delay, with costs of repair alleged at 2.7 million. Settlement, 1 million. Why so little? Either they couldn't prove the damages, or more likely the defendants had no insurance and no assets. At least the developer is trying to limit future claims of the owners. Next slide, please. In the middle, USA and Sanders versus Nelson. U.S. District Court in San Diego, the Department of Justice, and the Legal Aid Society of San Diego. You don't want those people suing you, believe me. The Department of Justice and the Legal Aid Society claims that a property owner / manager sexually harassed tenants with threats of eviction if the tenants objected and didn't cooperate with the sexual harassment. That defendant settled $580,000 for sexual harassment to the Department of Justice, plus an injunction against all future management activities. If you're a property manager, this is a bad idea. Left side, $80,000, Nairobi versus Watkins. Who is the winner and what is a winner? In Alameda Superior Court, a tenant sued for apartment leaks, sued the landlord, smelled mold. The defendant, apartment owner, jumps in, does the right thing, fixes the leaks, replaces the carpet, removes the mold. Everything was done right. But the property owner failed to get a certificate of occupancy from the city of Oakland, so no one was really allowed to live there. Jury trial, the tenant wins breach of warranty for lack of a certificate of occupancy, $80,000. But the landlord was found to have no liability for the mold and leaks because they fixed everything right away. They are the prevailing party, as we discussed earlier. They won most of what they asked for. So they get their attorney's fees, $98,000 against The tenant who only had a breach of warranty recovery of 80,000. Who pays the 18,000? In theory, it's the tenant that brought the case. When is a victory a loss? When you end up net paying the other side. Right-hand side, same slide, Olson versus Professional Community Management of California. Plaintiff is a property manager for a property management company. The property manager plaintiff develops stage 4 cancer, and while he's out in being treated, the HOA board, where he was an on-site manager, decides to eliminate his job and not have an on-site manager any longer. When the plaintiff with cancer in remission returns to the job, he wants to go back to the same place. But that HOA board eliminated the manager's live-in on-site job. So the management company offers the plaintiff 30 other positions, all of which the plaintiff refuses and sues for disability discrimination, sues the management company and the HOA board that eliminated the live-in manager job. Motion for summary judgment. The property manager with cancer loses. There were reasonable accommodations to his disability, and he decided to turn them down. The management company prevails. Next slide, please. On the left, Smith versus Empire Today Flooring and Vargas Flooring. On this verdict and settlement, I gotta say, you can't make this up. This stuff happens, and there's nothing you can do about it, usually. So in Smith versus Empire Today, plaintiff is a unit owner. The unit owner buys new carpeting for the townhouse. The townhouse is being recarpeted by the flooring company that removes the old carpeting and, according to the plaintiff, throws the carpeting out the second-story window so that a 200-pound carpet roll allegedly hits the plaintiff and causes a lot of disability, according to the plaintiff. The defendant carpet company says this never happened. The injuries allegedly coming from the 200 pounds of carpeting thrown out the window, these were all pre-existing. In mediation, the plaintiff owner, allegedly hit by carpeting, wants $8 million. The defendant carpet company offers $50,000, rejected. Jury verdict, plaintiff loses. They must have believed the carpet company. This happens. Who pays for the defense when you walk out with no liability? That's what insurance is for, cost of defense. Middle bubble. Garcia versus Pinnacle 1617. The defendant is the Sheraton San Diego. The plaintiff says that the San Diego Sheraton's website did not properly disclose details of handicap accessibility in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The defendant says the plaintiff has full accessibility for disabled persons. We just didn't list all of it online. We did the right thing. The plaintiff is wrong in its claims. The court rules the plaintiff loses. This is very unusual. Most disabled plaintiffs who claim violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, usually they win. In this case, they did not. There's one last bubble, and I want to direct this at the attorneys that are watching today. These are rulings from the state bar court enforcing alleged violations by attorneys. Barry S., an attorney, suffered a misdemeanor conviction because Barry shoplifted $277 worth of goods from a department store. What does that have to do with practicing law? According to the state bar, a lot. That's a finding of moral turpitude. Barry S. is suspended for 90 days and 1 year of probation. Barry S. is lucky he didn't get this part. Domino W., another licensed attorney, again, misdemeanor conviction for shoplifting, $290. He failed to report this to the state bar, the conviction, and obtained 2 years. And so the state bar brought license proceedings against Domino W. Result, 2 years of probation against Domino W. as an attorney. You might say, hey, in San Francisco, nobody enforces shoplifting. Guess what? Some do. And you might say, the state bar is about practicing law. It has nothing to do with convictions for shoplifting. But the state bar doesn't see it that way. Just be very careful if you do anything that is a legal violation while you're an attorney. So this concludes the case law, verdicts, and settlements portion of the ECHO program for today. And on behalf of the legal resource panel at ECHO, I want to thank you very much for coming and learning about all the developments that affect your responsibilities. Thank you very much. And we'll turn this back over to David and Connor.
Well, hi, and thanks, Mark, for a really great presentation. We have time for about 10 minutes worth of Q&A. If any of you have any questions of Mark, any of the cases, you can put it in the chat room, or if you'd like, just go ahead and raise your hand and we can draw on you. Does anyone have any questions about some of the verdicts and cases in this particular presentation segment?
Let me just add a few things while you're thinking about that.
Sure.
A lot of these cases and verdicts and settlements, the question that is really most important is who pays for this? Is there insurance for the attorneys that are fighting? If one of the parties owes money, there's liability to owe money. Is there insurance to protect against that liability? It's really difficult to understand the scope of coverage and the limits of coverage depending on the claims of the case. The best thing a person can usually do is to try to analyze the risks, the amounts of liability, the potential for unforeseen, maybe crazy claims, and do the best to protect against that, and have insurance to provide a defense and coverage to cover amounts that are likely to be claimed or maybe even imposed against you. That's the lesson of a lot of what these cases teach you.
Great. So we have a question from Carol Moore. So Carol, would you like to ask Mark your question, please?
Actually, this was absolutely wonderful. I can't tell you how I was just enthralled by all of these cases, the logic of it. You know, one quick one, that one case with the Coastal Commission actually occurred in Laguna Beach. Laguna Beach had a homeowner association where it had not had short-term rentals. They decided the owners could make money and decided to start doing that. And the people complained and said, hey, we're workers and we're staying up all night because visitors are coming to your short-term rentals and we don't want to have this. And actually, Kevin De Leon, who's on the Coastal Commission, said, no, you can't do that. You can't, because they said, well, you know, there are all kinds of places to rent here and so forth. And his statement was, well, low-income people have a right to find low-income rentals, as if you can find a low-income rental in Laguna Beach. At any rate, they lost on that. And there was no court case, but they did lose to the Coastal Commission and didn't go further. My question was, using the logic on the CC&Rs, there have been a couple of bills that said, I think now it's something like 25%. You can't restrict, I think, less than 25% rentals in your HOA. I believe that's what it says. So, but using the logic that you had earlier, you buy your condo and there were no restrictions, none on how many rentals you could own. There was no statement in the CC&Rs, nor was there any statement on the number in the HOA that could be rented. Then the HOA decides to put a number and said, oh, you can only own yours and one other, or there's one issue, or you cannot, we can have only 25% rentals. They never said there was a restriction. What do you think on that? Because when you purchase, neither of those restrictions were enforced or listed in the CC&Rs. Thank you again.
There are other statutes that deal with rental restrictions, but this case that we cited deals with a specific statute. And the specific statute says, regardless of any other rental restrictions, the only restrictions that can apply to an owner of a unit are those restrictions that were in place when the owner purchased. Why would they do that? The only thing I can guess is that the legislature is trying to increase housing availability. The legislature is biased in favor of making housing rentals available to as many people as possible. And that might explain why they enacted the statute. And this is all based on a statute that says you cannot restrict an owner's right to rent or the duration of the rental unless those restrictions were in place when the owner purchased.
That's an excellent answer. So Mary, sorry, Carol, we have you on mute.
When they put that in place, I wish I could recall when it was, like 2014 maybe, when they said, it states in there very clearly, if you had a right, it doesn't restrict if you previously had a right. Isn't there a bit? I'd have to look that one up because I kind of remember that being in there too. And it was around 2014 before these rental demands occurred. This has just been so excellent. I've just been excited about it. Thank you for your help.
You bet. And let's go to Mary Wood and ask her to ask her question. Mary?
Yeah, mine is really similar. I mean, based on all these cases, well, you can get in a lot of trouble filing a lawsuit, a lot of money. And my concern is I'd like to rent my unit out. And this new law, as I understand it, it could say the laws applied at the time I bought, which said I couldn't rent it out. But okay, so assuming I can rent it out, how do I do that? I go and rent it out and they don't have any system for implementing the new laws. In fact, they were caught off guard. They appealed to the state legislature after it passed. And we're talking about Rossmore, which is a 7,000 house community. So I guess my question is, am I going to get sued if I go out and rent my place out?
Anybody can sue anybody for anything. All I'm trying to report to you is what the statutes are coming down and how the courts are interpreting them. You may have a defense. It may cost you a lot to fight in court to win your defense. I simply don't know. If you have a question and you want to rent, I would talk to an attorney and explain the CC&Rs and governing documents and maybe cite one of these cases that are available on the website for ECHO and try to get some personal advice for yourself. I simply don't know.
Okay. And John Rickard says, my understanding is the grandfathering is to be fair under the legal concept of double jeopardy. Have you heard that?
Double jeopardy is a concept that applies to criminal prosecutions and game shows. So I'm not familiar with the idea of double jeopardy regarding anything I've talked about. I simply don't know.
Okay, and then there is a question here that I think is, I hear quite a bit. When opening a pool to the public, who is the public?
Well, this calls for an interpretation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I do not specialize in the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in general, my understanding is that if you offer a rental swimming pool use to the public at large through an Airbnb type of website, some of these provisions may become applicable to you. And even if the ADA and the FEHA is not applicable to you, I don't know, are you protected for an injury? And here's a really interesting question. Let's say you own a home and you duly pay for high amounts of liability insurance. Then you go to a website and lease out your pool by the hour. Does your homeowner's insurance cover a business use of your swimming pool? It could be no. The policy may have to be amended with your carrier, with your sales agent, insurance agent, to show you are conducting a business on your property if you want coverage. So it just raises more questions than it possibly could justify a couple $100 an hour for let somebody in your backyard to use a swimming pool. Just doesn't, to me, it makes no sense at all.
So one last really quick question before we go into breakouts. Can we restrict rentals to seniors per the HUD designation of our community? So it must
I
be a
have absolutely no idea.
Senior community. Okay.
I don't know about HUD senior communities, and I am not able to answer your question. I would refer you to an attorney that specializes in that sort of thing. I don't know.
Okay. So let's take this opportunity to say thanks to Mark. We're going to have a chat room now. We will move into the last breakout chat room of the day. Please visit our sponsors and speakers at the event. We'd appreciate it if you said hello and thank you to them. They've made this educational seminar possible at no cost to you. Remember to stay until the end of the program for a chance to participate in our raffle, which is brought to you by C&A Painting. Thank you, and we'll break into the sessions now.
Thank you, everybody.